The coffee pot made the same sound it had made for 28 years. 3 short burbles, a hiss, then silence. Margaret Chen stood at the kitchen counter at 6:15 in the morning, pouring 2 cups out of habit. The muscle memory was so deeply carved into her body that her hands moved before her brain could stop them. 1 cup with cream and sugar, 1 black. She stared at the second cup for a long moment, steam rising like a ghost between them, before she poured it slowly into the sink. 8 months, 243 days. Daniel had been gone for 8 months, and she still set the table for 2. The morning light came through the kitchen window at the same angle it always had, catching dust particles in the air, making them dance. Everything looked the same. The coffee maker, the table, the chair where Daniel used to sit reading the news on his tablet. The world had not stopped when her husband's heart had. It just kept going, indifferent and relentless, demanding that she keep going too. She carried her coffee to his office. She called it his office, even though the house was solely hers now, even though the mortgage and the deed and the utility bills all had her name alone. Some spaces hold the shape of the people who inhabited them. Daniel's office was one of those spaces. His recording equipment sat untouched on the desk. Microphone, audio interface, headphones draped over the monitor like he had just stepped away for a moment, like he might walk back in any second, asking her if she wanted to hear the latest interview. The podcast, his passion project, the thing he had poured his final year into, while his heart was quietly preparing to betray him. Maggie sat in his chair. It still smelled faintly of him, Old Spice and coffee and something else, something indefinable that was just Daniel. She opened the laptop. The password was still saved. The desktop background was still the photo of them in Yosemite, 10 years ago, before the word cancer had entered their vocabulary, before retirement, before everything had narrowed down to doctor's appointments and medication schedules, and trying to fit a lifetime of unfinished dreams into whatever time remained. The podcast files were organized in folders, interviews 1 through 43, each one a story, each one an immigrant who had come to America with nothing and built everything. Daniel had believed these stories mattered. Not the famous ones, not the tech billionaires or the politicians. The ordinary ones, the dry cleaner who put 3 kids through college, the engineer who fled Vietnam with his family in a fishing boat, the teacher who learned English at 40 and now taught Shakespeare to high schoolers. 43 stories recorded, 4 more planned. Daniel had died before he could finish. Maggie had promised herself she would complete it. She had promised him, in those final lucid moments before the morphine took him somewhere she could not follow. She had promised Sarah, their daughter, though Sarah did not understand why it mattered. She had promised herself, because some promises are the only thing standing between a person and the abyss. But promising was easier than doing. She had tried these past 8 months. She had sat in this chair, opened these files, listened to Daniel's voice asking questions, drawing out stories. Her fingers had hovered over the keyboard, ready to edit, to splice, to shape the raw audio into something finished. And every time, the paralysis had come, the weight of it, the impossibility of finishing something he had started, of trying to do justice to his vision when she barely understood the software, barely understood how he had made it all work. Her phone buzzed on the desk, a text from Sarah. "Mom, you need to move on, sell the house, come stay with me." Sarah had been sending variations of this message for months. Maggie deleted it without responding. Some conversations required more energy than she had available. Some conversations would only lead to the same argument, the same frustration, the same daughter who thought her mother was stuck, and the same mother who could not explain that stuck was the only thing keeping her upright. Maggie clicked on interview 44. The next one, the one that needed to be completed. Mrs. Kim, elderly Korean woman, came to Los Angeles in 1976, ran a dry cleaning business for 40 years. Daniel had recorded the interview 3 weeks before he died. Maggie had never listened to it, could not bring herself to hear his voice, so alive, so engaged, so close to the end without knowing it. She clicked play. Daniel's voice filled the small office. "Mrs. Kim, thank you so much for sitting down with me today." The woman's accented voice, warm and textured. "Oh, your wife make the tea. So kind. Tell her thank you." You can tell her yourself, she's right here. Maggie's breath caught. She had been there. She had made tea. She had sat quietly in the corner while Daniel worked the way she always had, being helpful, being supportive, being invisible. She pressed pause. The silence rushed back in, heavy and absolute. She needed to upload this file to the cloud storage. The cultural center was waiting. They had a launch date. December 15th, Daniel's birthday, 5 weeks away. They needed the final episodes. They needed her to deliver what she had promised. She clicked the upload button. The progress bar appeared. 1%, 2%. Then it froze. The spinning wheel of death appeared on the screen. Network connection lost. Maggie frowned. She checked the Wi-Fi icon. Connected, it said, but clearly lying. She closed the laptop, opened it again, same result. The internet was gone. Virus. This had happened before. The router sometimes needed resetting. She walked to the utility closet, reset the router, waited. Nothing. She pulled out her phone, tried to load a web page. No connection. She walked to the window, looked outside as if the answer might be visible in the suburban street beyond. That was when she saw it. The lock, shining in the morning sun like it had every right to be there. Gleaming chrome padlock, industrial grade, the kind you would see on a construction site or a storage unit, bolted onto the utility box on the side of her house. The box Daniel had installed 18 months ago, back when he was still healthy enough to climb ladders and run Ethernet cable and explain to her how the whole system worked. Back when he had been the one who handled these things, the technical things, the complicated things. Back when she had let him handle them because it was easier, because he was good at it, because she had other things to manage. The box was supposed to be accessible. That was the whole point. Service access, Daniel had called it. He had shown her once, opened it up, pointed to the various components. Internet junction, power monitoring, cable management. She had nodded, not really understanding, trusting that he understood enough for both of them. Now there was a lock where there should not be a lock. Maggie stood at her kitchen window, coffee growing cold in her hand, staring at this impossible thing. For a long moment, her brain simply refused to process it. Locks did not appear spontaneously. Someone had put it there. Someone had come onto her property, onto the side of her house, and locked her out of her own equipment. She set down her coffee and went outside. The morning air was cool, October in Northern California. That brief window when the heat finally broke, and the air remembered what fresh meant. The grass was wet with dew. She had not mowed in 2 weeks. Daniel used to mow every Saturday. Now the lawn service came every other Thursday, and the yard looked maintained but not loved. There was a difference. She walked around to the side of the house, following the path Daniel had worn into the grass from his many trips to check the connections, to troubleshoot problems, to tinker with the setup. The utility box was mounted at eye level on the exterior wall. Gray metal, 18 inches square, official looking. City permit sticker in the corner. Faded now from a 1.5 years of sun and rain, but still readable. City of Pinehurst, Department of Public Works. Permit approved August 2023. And now, bolted across the latch that Daniel's hands had opened 100 times, a brand new padlock gleamed. Chrome finish, thick shackle, the kind of lock that cost $40 at the hardware store. The kind designed to withstand bolt cutters and determination. Someone had gone to the expense. Someone had made this choice deliberately. Next to the lock, someone had slapped an orange sticker. Not professionally printed, not official looking up close, just a generic safety sticker, the kind you could buy in bulk online. Safety violation. It screamed in bold black letters. Do not tamper. Authorized personnel only. But there was no department name, no contact number, no citation reference, just words meant to intimidate. Words meant to make her believe this was official when it was anything but. Maggie reached out and touched the lock. The metal was cold under her fingers. Real, solid, unyielding. She pulled on it gently, as if maybe it was some kind of joke, some kind of mistake that would reveal itself if she just tested it. The lock did not budge. She pulled harder. Nothing. The installation was professional. Whoever had done this knew what they were doing. She examined the box itself more closely. The paint was scratched around the lock area. Fresh scratches. This had happened recently, yesterday maybe, while she had been inside, probably sitting at Daniel's desk, probably trying to work up the courage to edit another interview. Someone had been out here, on her property, drilling, installing, locking her out of her own equipment. The violation of it settled over her like a weight. Not just the act itself, but the presumption. The assumption that they could, that she would not notice, or would not care, or would not fight back. Her first thought, rising up from decades of conditioning, was that she must have done something wrong, that there was some rule she had not known about, some procedure she had failed to follow, that this was somehow her fault. Her second thought was interrupted by a voice. "Good morning, Mrs. Chen." She turned. Richard Thornton stood on her lawn, 3 feet away, clipboard tucked under his arm. He wore khakis and a polo shirt and an expression of practiced concern. Behind him, 2 other board members hovered like attendants. Gerald Shue, the retired lawyer, looking uncomfortable. Monica Reeves, the realtor, studying her phone with intense concentration. Richard was the HOA president, had been for 6 years. Maggie knew him the way you know neighbors in a suburban development where everyone waves but nobody really talks. Pleasant exchanges about weather, nods across the street, the occasional board meeting she had attended out of obligation, sitting in the back, saying nothing, watching him run the meetings with the precision of a corporate executive and the warmth of a parking enforcement officer. She had never liked him. There was something in the way he looked at people, like he was cataloging their weaknesses, like he was calculating how much pressure it would take to make them bend. Daniel had not liked him either, though Daniel had been diplomatic about it. Too controlling, Daniel had said once after a particularly tedious meeting about mailbox regulations. Needs to relax. It's an HOA, not a government. Now Richard stood on her lawn at 6:45 in the morning, looking at her with an expression that was somehow both sympathetic and triumphant. He had the kind of face that people trusted. Clean-shaven, professional haircut, going slightly silver at the temples. He looked like someone who had spent a career in boardrooms. She knew from neighborhood gossip that he had been a corporate attorney before retirement. Contract law. The kind of work that required finding loopholes and exploiting them. "I see you found our notice," he said. His voice was smooth, practiced, the voice of someone who spent decades making bad news sound reasonable. Maggie looked at the lock, at the sticker, at Richard trying to connect the pieces into something that made sense. "You put a lock on my utility box," she said. It was not quite a question, more an attempt to make reality cooperate with logic. Richard tilted his head slightly, like a professor about to correct a student. "We secured community infrastructure," he said. The language was practiced, deliberate, every word chosen carefully. "There's an important distinction, Mrs. Chen." Maggie felt something cold settle in her stomach. "This is not community infrastructure," she said quietly. "This box services my house, my internet, my power monitoring, my cable management." Richard smiled. It was not a kind smile. It was the smile of someone who had prepared for this conversation, who had anticipated her objections, who had answers ready. Answers that were not really answers, but walls disguised as explanations. "Mrs. Chen, I understand this is frustrating, but we've had complaints." "What complaints? From who?" He did not answer directly. She would learn this about Richard Thornton in the hours and days to come. He did not answer questions. He deflected them, redirected them, buried them under procedure and policy and carefully chosen language. He turned conversations into mazes where you ended up exactly where he wanted you without ever quite knowing how you got there. "Safety concerns," he said instead, making a note on his clipboard. "Liability issues. The association has a responsibility to all residents. We can't have unmonitored equipment creating potential hazards." "What hazards?" Maggie asked. "This box was installed with city permits. Inspected, approved." "That was then," Richard said smoothly. "Regulations change. Standards evolve. We need to ensure everything meets current requirements." "It does meet current requirements," Maggie said, feeling her voice getting smaller even as she tried to make it stronger. "The city inspected it last year. Everything passed." "HOA standards," Richard clarified, "not city standards. There's a difference." Gerald shifted his weight behind Richard, looking like he wanted to be anywhere else. Monica kept her eyes on her phone. Maggie forced herself to breathe slowly. "How long until you remove it?" Richard's smile widened slightly. That depends on several factors. We'll need to conduct a full safety review, bring in certified inspectors, verify compliance with all relevant codes and ordinances. These things take time. How much time? He shrugged. Indefinitely. The word hung in the air between them. Indefinitely. No internet, no cloud storage, no podcast uploads. The cultural center was waiting. December 15th was 5 weeks away. Daniel's birthday. The launch date. The deadline that was the only thing giving these empty days structure and purpose. I need internet access, Maggie said. Her voice sounded small even to her own ears. I have work. I have obligations. Richard made a note on his clipboard. I'm sure you can make alternative arrangements. Coffee shops have Wi-Fi, the library. There are many options. She wanted to argue, wanted to point out that this was absurd, that he had no right, that the box was permitted and inspected and legal. But the words stuck in her throat. Confrontation had never been her strength. Daniel had been the one who argued with customer service representatives, who pushed back against bureaucratic nonsense, who refused to accept no when no did not make sense. Maggie had always been the one who smiled and accommodated and made peace. Is there anything else? Richard asked. His tone suggested the conversation was over. She shook her head. No, nothing else. He nodded, satisfied, and turned to leave. Gerald followed quickly. Monica glanced up from her phone long enough to offer Maggie an apologetic shrug before hurrying after them. Maggie stood alone on her lawn, looking at the lock, feeling the familiar weight of her own inadequacy pressing down on her shoulders. She had not fought, had not demanded, had not done anything except accept what this man had decided for her. Just like she had accepted the doctor's dismissiveness when Daniel had complained about chest pains. Just like she had accepted Sarah's frustration when Maggie had not pushed for second opinions. Just like she had spent her entire life accepting what others decided. Because fighting required a kind of energy she did not possess, a kind of certainty she had never felt. She went back inside. The house was too quiet. It was always too quiet now. In Daniel's office, the laptop still showed the frozen upload screen. Network connection lost. 3 hours of work, gone. She would have to start over. But she could not start over because she had no internet. She tried her phone's hotspot. Too slow. The audio files were massive. High-quality recordings, multiple tracks, hours of content. A mobile hotspot would take days to upload a single episode. Her phone buzzed. Email from Jennifer Kim, the director at the Cultural Center, the woman who had worked with Daniel on the podcast project, who had believed in it, who had secured funding and space and publicity. Hi, Maggie. Just checking in. How are the final episodes coming? We're getting excited about the launch. Let me know if you need anything. Maggie stared at the message. What she needed was internet. What she needed was for Richard Thornton to unlock her utility box. What she needed was for this to not be happening. She did not reply. Instead, she opened the filing cabinet, the one Daniel had kept in his office, full of important papers. Birth certificates, tax returns, insurance policies, and permits. He had been meticulous about permits. Every home improvement, every installation, documented and filed. She found the folder labeled Utility Box. Inside, Daniel's careful handwriting on the permit application. Single residence service, private access. City permit number 4428, approved and stamped with an official seal. Installation date, inspection date, approval signature. And tucked into the folder, a small sticky note in Daniel's handwriting. Just in case we ever need this. The R was written in his distinctive way, the little flourish at the end that she would recognize anywhere. He had known. Somehow he had known that this might be needed someday. Had anticipated trouble. Had prepared for it in his quiet, methodical way. Maggie sat at his desk, holding the permit. And for the first time since the morning she had found him unresponsive in their bed, she allowed herself to feel anger instead of grief. A knock at the front door pulled her back to the present. She opened it to find an elderly woman on her porch. Helen Morrison, from 3 houses down. Maggie knew her vaguely. They had exchanged pleasantries at neighborhood gatherings. Helen had brought a casserole after Daniel's funeral, one of dozens that had filled the refrigerator with food Maggie could not eat. Helen was 71, white-haired, with sharp blue eyes that had seen too much, and a directness that made people uncomfortable. She wore gardening clothes, dirt under her fingernails, the practical uniform of a woman who spent her days trying to keep her hands busy enough that her mind could not wander to dark places. She did not wait for an invitation. "I saw Richard at your utility box," she said. "What did that man do now?" Maggie stepped back, allowing Helen inside. "Just HOA business," she said automatically. The script was easy. Deflect, minimize, don't make waves, safety inspection. Helen laughed, but there was no humor in it. The sound was bitter and knowing and so full of pain that Maggie actually flinched. "Honey, Richard doesn't do safety. He does control." She walked into the living room like she owned it, settled into Daniel's chair without asking, her hands gripping the armrest like she needed something solid to anchor her. Maggie followed, uncertain, still holding the coffee cup she had forgotten she was carrying. "Let me tell you about Richard Thornton," Helen said. Her voice was steady, but underneath it, Maggie heard something else. Pain. Old and deep and carefully managed. 3 years ago, my husband Frank died. Suicide. He jumped off the Morrison Bridge on a Tuesday afternoon at 4:15. They found his car on the shoulder, engine still running, keys in the ignition. His phone on the passenger seat with a note typed into it saying he was sorry. Maggie sat down slowly. "I'm so sorry." The words felt inadequate. They always did. There was no adequate response to that kind of loss. Helen nodded. "Everyone is. People brought casseroles, sent cards, came to the funeral and said the right things about how Frank was at peace now, how his suffering was over." She looked at Maggie directly. "But here's what they don't know. What nobody knows except me and now you. Frank didn't jump because he was sick or depressed in the clinical sense. He jumped because Richard Thornton spent 2 years making his life hell." The words hung in the air. Maggie wanted to say something, but her throat had closed up. Helen kept going, the words coming faster now, like a dam finally breaking after years of holding back. "It started small. Most abuse does. A violation notice about our mailbox being the wrong shade of black. Frank ignored it, figured it was a mistake. Then another notice. The fence was 2 inches too tall. We'd had that fence for 15 years. Suddenly, it was a problem. Frank measured it himself. It was exactly to code, but Richard said code had changed, produced bylaws we'd never seen, demanded we cut it down or face fines." Helen's hands trembled slightly. She folded them in her lap, pressing them together until the knuckles went white. "Frank cut the fence. Took him a whole weekend. He was 72 years old, climbing ladders, using a saw, trying to satisfy this man's arbitrary rules. Thought that would be the end of it. But with Richard, there's never an end. There's just the next thing." The shed was 6 inches too close to the property line. The trees needed trimming. The grass was too long. The grass was too short. Someone complained about noise, though we were the quietest people on the street. Frank barely slept anymore. Every morning he'd check the mailbox, afraid of what violation would be waiting. Every evening, he'd walk the property looking for anything Richard might cite next. Maggie found her voice. Why didn't he fight back? Helen's smile was sad and knowing. He tried. Hired a lawyer. Gerald Shue, actually. The same Gerald who's on the board now. Gerald did his best. But Richard had more money, more time, more willingness to drag things out. Every response cost us $500. Every filing. Every letter. We spent $18,000 in legal fees trying to fight violations that should never have existed in the first place. The number hit Maggie like a physical blow. $18,000. Frank was a proud man, Helen continued. Came to this country from Ireland when he was 19, worked construction for 40 years, built our retirement savings dollar by dollar. Watching it drain away to fight Richard's harassment, it broke something in him. He felt like a failure, like he couldn't protect our home, like he couldn't protect me. Helen's voice cracked. She stopped, breathed, steadied herself. 2 days before he died, he told me he felt like he was drowning, and every time he got his head above water, Richard pushed him back under. He said he couldn't fight anymore, said he was too tired, too old, too beaten down. I didn't believe him. I thought he was just venting. We'd been married 48 years. You learn someone's rhythms. You learn to tell the difference between bad days and dangerous days. But I was wrong. Or maybe I didn't want to see it. Maybe I told myself it would get better because the alternative was too terrible to consider. The silence that followed was heavy. Maggie could hear the clock ticking in the kitchen, could hear her own heartbeat, could hear Helen's careful breathing as she fought for composure. "Your husband Daniel stood up to Richard once," Helen said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "Did you know that?" Maggie shook her head, unable to speak. "6 months before Daniel died. I was walking past your house, heard raised voices, stopped because I was worried. Richard wanted to inspect your utility box, kept saying it needed to be brought into compliance. Daniel told him no, told him the box was permitted, inspected, and none of Richard's business, told him to try and touch it and see what happens." Helen smiled, but tears ran down her cheeks. "I wanted to cheer, wanted to run over and shake Daniel's hand, because nobody talks to Richard like that. Nobody stands their ground. They all fold eventually." But Daniel didn't. He stood there on his lawn, sick as he was, dying as he was, and he didn't back down 1 inch. Richard left, but he told Daniel that this conversation wasn't over, that he'd deal with it when the time was right. Helen looked at Maggie. "Richard's been waiting for Daniel to die, and now you're alone, and he thinks you'll fold like everyone else does." The weight of this new information settled over Maggie. Daniel had fought, had refused, had stood his ground, and she had known nothing about it. He had protected her from the stress, from the conflict, from knowing that this battle was waiting for her, because 6 months before his death, she had been managing his medical appointments, his medications, his slow decline into the final darkness. He had carried this burden alone because he loved her enough to spare her. But now there was no one to spare her. Now the burden was hers alone. Maggie's whole life had been an exercise in accommodation, in making herself smaller so that others could be bigger, in staying quiet so that others could be heard. It had started young, with immigrant parents who had given up everything to come to America, who had worked 3 jobs between them to give her opportunities they had never had. The unspoken message had been clear: don't make trouble, don't cause problems, be grateful for what you have. Success comes through hard work and keeping your head down, not through confrontation and making waves. She had internalized that message so completely that it had become who she was. In school, when a teacher had graded her unfairly, she had accepted it. When classmates had been cruel, she had absorbed it without fighting back. When she had faced discrimination for being the only Asian girl in her class, she had smiled and worked harder to prove she belonged. Confrontation was for other people, people who were braver, people who were stronger, people who were more American. Her marriage to Daniel had been happy. She had loved him with her whole heart. But even there, the pattern had continued. He had made the big decisions: where they would live, how they would spend their money, what jobs to take or leave. She had supported his choices, enabled his dreams, made space for his ambitions. She had told herself it was partnership, that marriage was about compromise, that someone had to lead and someone had to follow, and it did not matter who did which as long as they were moving in the same direction. But it had mattered, because when Daniel had gotten sick, when he had needed someone to fight for him, to push back against doctors who were too quick to dismiss his symptoms, she had not known how. 26 years as an elementary school teacher had taught her how to follow rules, how to fill out forms, how to manage difficult parents with patience and deflection. But it had not taught her how to demand better, how to refuse to accept the first answer when the first answer was killing her husband. Stage 3 colon cancer, they had finally said. Treatable if caught early. But they had not caught it early. 3 different doctors had told Daniel his symptoms were stress, were age, were nothing to worry about. Take antacids, get more exercise, reduce your workload. By the time someone had actually run the tests, stage 3 was optimistic. Stage 4 was the reality they were living with. Sarah had begged her mother to fight, to get second opinions, to find the best specialists, to refuse to accept a death sentence without exhausting every option. But Maggie had trusted the doctors, had believed they knew best, had not wanted to be difficult, to be the demanding wife who questioned medical expertise and made trouble. She had been supportive instead, loving, present, driving Daniel to appointments, managing his medications, holding his hand through the worst of the treatments, but never fighting, never demanding better care than what they were getting, never being difficult, Daniel had died 8 months ago. Heart attack while he slept. The cancer had been in remission. They had thought they were winning. But the treatment had weakened his heart, and no one had been monitoring it closely enough. He had simply stopped breathing sometime between midnight and dawn, and she had woken up next to his body already going cold. Sarah had been devastated. But more than devastated, she had been angry. Not at the doctors, though they deserved it. At her mother. "You let him die," Sarah had said in the raw, terrible days after the funeral. "You didn't fight for him. You never fight for anything. You just accept and accommodate and make yourself smaller until there's nothing left." The words had cut deeper than any blade. Because they were true. Because Maggie knew they were true. Because she had spent 8 months since then trying to figure out how to live with the knowledge that maybe if she had been braver, more demanding, more willing to make trouble, Daniel would still be alive. Now here she sat. Another moment requiring courage she did not have. Another battle she did not know how to fight. Another choice between standing up and staying quiet. Maggie looked at her hands. "Maybe I should just let it go," she said. Her voice sounded hollow even to herself. "I don't have the energy for this. I have too much else to deal with." Even as she said the words, she knew they were a lie. She had energy. She had time. What she did not have was courage. What she had never had, in 53 years of life, was the ability to stand up and fight back when fighting back required confrontation. Helen reached over and took Maggie's hand. Her grip was surprisingly strong. "Sweetheart, I'm not telling you this to pressure you. I'm telling you this so you know what you're dealing with. Richard doesn't just want to win. He wants to break people. It's how he operates." "Why are you telling me this?" Maggie asked. "Because I couldn't fight for Frank." Helen's voice cracked slightly. "But maybe I can help you fight for Daniel's legacy. My nephew Robert is a lawyer, civil rights cases. He handles HOA disputes. He's good." Maggie pulled her hand back gently. "I don't want to make trouble." Helen stood up. "Trouble is already here. You're just deciding whether to face it." She pulled a business card from her purse, set it on the coffee table. "That's Robert's number. Call him. Or don't. But don't tell yourself you don't have a choice. That's what Richard wants you to believe." After Helen left, Maggie sat in the quiet house, looking at the business card. Robert Kim, attorney at law, civil rights and housing disputes. She thought about Daniel, about his strength, about the way he had refused to back down from Richard 6 months before his death, about the sticky note on the permit. "Just in case we ever need this." She thought about Sarah, her daughter, sending texts about moving on, about selling the house, about starting over. Sarah who resented her mother's passivity. Sarah who had begged Maggie to fight the doctors, to get second opinions, to push harder. Sarah who believed, maybe rightly, that Daniel might still be alive if Maggie had been braver. She thought about the podcast, the 43 stories, the 4 unfinished interviews, Mrs. Kim's voice on the recording, thanking her for the tea. "Tell her thank you yourself," Daniel had said. "She's right here." She had been there, always in the background, always supportive and helpful and silent. She picked up the business card. Before she could talk herself out of it, she dialed the number. A man answered on the 3rd ring. Robert Kim. Her voice shook slightly. "Mr. Kim, my name is Margaret Chen. I'm Helen Morrison's neighbor. I need help with an HOA situation." There was a pause. Then, "Tell me what happened." And for the first time in 8 months, Maggie told someone what was happening. Not what had happened, past tense, historical. What was happening? Present tense. Now. She explained about the lock, about Richard, about the podcast deadline, about Daniel's fight 6 months before his death. The words came slowly at first, then faster, like something long dammed finally breaking through. Robert listened without interrupting. When she finished, he said, "Can I come by tomorrow morning? I'll need to see the setup, review the permits, understand the timeline." "Yes," Maggie said, "thank you." "Mrs. Chen, one more thing." "Yes?" "What you're dealing with, it's not uncommon. HOA presidents who confuse authority with ownership. But it's also not insurmountable. You have rights. We just need to make sure they're enforced." After she hung up, Maggie walked back to Daniel's office. She sat in his chair. She looked at his recording equipment. She opened the laptop and clicked on interview 44 again. Mrs. Kim, thank you so much for sitting down with me today. Oh, your wife make the tea, so kind. Tell her, thank you. You can tell her yourself, she's right here. Maggie had been there, silent, supportive, invisible. But she was still here, and Daniel was not. And the only way to finish what he had started was to stop being invisible. Her phone buzzed. Sarah, her daughter, not the cultural center director. Mom, did you get my text? We need to talk about the house. Maggie looked at the message for a long moment. Then she typed back. No, I'm not selling, I'm not moving, I'm finishing your father's podcast, and I'm fighting this HOA situation. I'm sorry I didn't fight harder when it mattered, but I'm fighting now. She hit send before she could reconsider. The response came quickly. 3 dots, typing. Then, Mom, what happened? Maggie typed slowly, carefully. I decided to stop being quiet. Another pause, then, about time. Maggie smiled despite herself, despite everything. Her daughter's approval, conditional as it was, felt like oxygen after months of holding her breath. That night, she could not sleep. She lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, listening to the house settle around her. Alone in the too big bed, alone in the too quiet house. Alone with her thoughts and her fears and her newfound determination that felt fragile as glass. At 2 a.m, she got up and went to the window. Across the street, Richard Thornton's house sat dark except for one window on the second floor. She could see his silhouette, backlit, pacing. He was awake too, probably planning his next move, probably confident that she would fold, that she would give up, that she would be like Frank Morrison and all the others who had bent under the weight of his relentless control. She looked at her own reflection in the window. Margaret Chen, 53 years old, widow, former teacher who had retired early to care for her dying husband. Woman who had spent her whole life being accommodating, being pleasant, being quiet. But Daniel had believed she could be more, had left her the sticky note, had prepared for this fight even knowing he would not be here to wage it, had trusted that she would find the strength when she needed it. Tomorrow, Robert Kim would come. Tomorrow she would start fighting back. Tomorrow, she would begin the work of becoming the person Daniel had believed she could be. But tonight, she stood at the window and let herself feel the full weight of what she was choosing. The fear, the uncertainty, the bone-deep knowledge that she was walking toward a battle she did not know how to fight. Across the street, Richard's light went out. Maggie stood in the darkness a moment longer, then went back to bed. Sleep did not come, but resolve did, quiet and steady. Not the loud courage of someone naturally brave, the quieter courage of someone terrified who chooses to act anyway. By the time dawn came, painting the sky in shades of gray and gold, Maggie was already awake, already dressed, already at Daniel's desk with the laptop open and the permits spread out, and Robert Kim's business card propped against the monitor. The coffee pot made its familiar sound. 3 short burbles, a hiss, then silence. She poured 1 cup. Just 1. She did not pour the second and then dump it out. She did not set the table for 2. Some habits could be broken. Some silences could be filled with voice. She sat down and clicked on interview 44. Mrs. Kim's voice filled the small office, telling the story of coming to America with 2 suitcases and a dream. Building a business from nothing. Raising children who became doctors and lawyers and teachers. The ordinary, extraordinary story of an immigrant who refused to be invisible. Maggie listened, really listened. Not just to the words, but to the spaces between them. The pauses where Daniel had waited, giving his subject time to find the right words. The gentle encouragement in his questions. The respect in his silence. He had known how to create space for other people's voices. Now she would have to find her own. At 8:30, there was a knock at the door. She opened it to find a man in his early 50s, Asian American, wearing a suit that looked expensive but lived in. He carried a leather briefcase and had the kind of face that inspired trust. Kind eyes behind glasses, slight gray at the temples. Mrs. Chen, I'm Robert Kim. She stepped aside. Come in. He entered, taking in the space with the practiced eye of someone who knew how to read rooms, read situations, read people. Thank you for calling, he said. Helen speaks highly of you. They sat in the living room. Maggie showed him the permits, explained the timeline, described the confrontation with Richard. Robert took notes, asked questions, listened with the kind of attention that made her feel heard. "This is straightforward from a legal perspective," he said finally. "The permit is clear, private access, single residence. Richard has no authority to lock your equipment. So I'm right," Maggie said. "You're right." Robert set down his pen. "But Mrs. Chen, being right doesn't guarantee winning, not against someone like Richard Thornton." "What do you mean?" "He has resources, time, money, legal knowledge. And based on what Helen told me about the Frank Morrison situation, he has no shame about using them. He'll bury you in paperwork, threaten legal action, drag this out as long as possible." The familiar fear crept back in. Maybe I should just let it go, find another way to finish the podcast. Robert was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Helen told me about your husband's project, the immigrant stories. He interviewed my parents. They own a dry cleaning business in Sacramento. Daniel gave them 3 hours, treated their story like it mattered as much as any CEO or politician." Maggie felt tears prick her eyes. "That was Daniel. He gave people voice," Robert said quietly. "Let me help you finish that work." They spent the next hour planning. Robert would file a formal complaint with the city, request an emergency inspection, document everything, build a paper trail that would make it harder for Richard to claim authority he did not have. "But I need you to understand," Robert said as he was leaving. "This will get ugly. Richard doesn't lose gracefully. He'll retaliate. There will be more violations, more threats, more pressure. Can you handle that?" Maggie thought about Daniel, about his courage, about the sticky note he had left her, about 43 stories waiting to be heard. "I don't know," she said honestly, "but I'm going to try." Robert smiled. "That's all any of us can do." After he left, Maggie stood at the window again. The utility box was visible from this angle, the lock gleaming in the morning sun. A small thing, a piece of metal and chrome, but somehow it had become the line in the sand, the place where she would either stand or fold. Her phone buzzed. Email from the city. Automated response to Robert's complaint. An inspector had been assigned, Kevin Santos. He would arrive tomorrow morning. Tomorrow. So soon. No time to prepare. No time to talk herself out of it. Her phone buzzed again. This time a text from Sarah, her daughter. "Mom, I'm proud of you. Call me later." Such simple words. But they carried the weight of years. Years of Sarah's frustration with her mother's passivity. Years of resentment over Daniel's death. Years of watching her mother disappear into grief and silence. Maggie typed back, "I will. I love you." The response came immediately. "Love you too." She set the phone down and went back to Daniel's office. The laptop was still open. The interview still paused. She clicked play and let Mrs. Kim's voice fill the room. This time she did not just listen. She opened the editing software. Tentatively at first, then with growing confidence, she began to work, trimming pauses, adjusting levels, shaping the raw audio into something polished. It was slow. She made mistakes, had to undo and redo, consulted YouTube tutorials, Googled technical terms, but she kept going. Because some promises were worth keeping, some voices were worth amplifying, some silences were meant to be broken, and somewhere, in the space between who she had been and who she was becoming, Margaret Chen found the thing Daniel had always believed was there. Her own voice, quiet but steady, scared but determined, imperfect but present. By the time the sun set that evening, she had completed her first real edit. It was not perfect. It was not what Daniel would have made, but it was hers. And it was done. She saved the file, backed it up to an external drive since the cloud was still inaccessible, made notes about what needed to be finished, created a timeline. 4 episodes, 5 weeks, it would be close. It would require internet. It would require fighting Richard Thornton and winning. But for the first time in 8 months, the future felt like something other than an endless stretch of empty days. It felt like a battle worth fighting, a promise worth keeping, a voice worth finding. She looked at Daniel's photo on the desk. He was smiling in it, caught mid-laugh at something she had said. The photo was 3 years old, taken before the diagnosis, before the decline, before the end, back when the future had still felt unlimited. "I'm doing it," she told the photo. "I'm scared and I don't know if I can, but I'm doing it." The photo did not answer. Photos never did, but somehow, in the silence, she felt his presence. Not the grief-soaked haunting of the past 8 months. Something else. Permission. Belief. Trust that she could carry forward what he had started. Outside, the sun disappeared below the horizon. The lock on the utility box caught the last rays of light, gleaming like a challenge, like a test. Tomorrow, the inspector would come. Tomorrow, the real fight would begin. Tomorrow, she would have to be brave in ways she had never managed before. But tonight, she sat in Daniel's chair and worked on his project and let herself imagine that maybe, just maybe, she was strong enough for what was coming. And if she was not strong enough now, perhaps she could become strong enough. One small act of courage at a time. One decision to speak instead of staying silent. One choice to fight instead of fold. The house settled around her, quiet but no longer oppressive, empty but no longer hollow. Margaret Chen, 53, widow, former teacher, scared woman, with a locked utility box and a deadline and a dead husband's dream resting on her shoulders. Tomorrow would come whether she was ready or not, so she would be ready, or at least she would try. And sometimes, trying was enough. Robert Kim arrived at 8:30 the next morning in a sedan that had seen better days, but was clean and well-maintained, the kind of car a person drove when they valued function over appearance. He stepped out carrying a leather briefcase that looked older than Maggie, worn soft at the corners, the patina of years visible in the creases. He was early 50s, Korean-American, wearing a suit that fit well but was not expensive. Reading glasses hung from a chain around his neck. The overall effect was professional without being intimidating, trustworthy. Maggie opened the door before he could knock. "Mr. Kim," she said, "thank you for coming." He smiled. It was a kind smile, the kind that reached his eyes. "Please call me Robert, and thank you for trusting me with this." They sat in the living room, the same room where Helen had told her about Frank, the same chair where Maggie had sat frozen with indecision less than 24 hours ago. But something had shifted overnight. The phone call had been the first step. Opening the door to Robert was the second. Each small act of forward motion made the next one slightly easier. Robert pulled out a yellow legal pad, the old-fashioned kind, and a pen. He took notes by hand, she would notice, not on a tablet or laptop. Something about that felt reassuring, solid, real in a way that digital never quite managed. "Tell me everything," he said. "Start from the beginning." So she did. The discovery of the lock, the confrontation with Richard, the orange sticker that was not official, the internet being down, the podcast deadline, Daniel's death, Helen's story about Frank Morrison. All of it spilled out in a rush of words that felt simultaneously too much and not enough. Robert listened without interrupting, his pen moving steadily across the page, his expression neutral but attentive. When she finished, he set down his pen. "May I see the utility box and the permits?" She led him outside. The morning was overcast, the kind of gray that promised rain later. The lock was still there, still gleaming, still impossible. Robert examined it closely, taking photos with his phone from multiple angles. He read the orange sticker, touched the fresh scratches in the paint, checked the city permit sticker that was still affixed to the box itself. "This is straightforward from a legal perspective," he said finally. "The permit is clear. Single residence, private access. Richard has no authority to restrict your access to your own equipment." Maggie felt something loosen in her chest. "So I'm right." "You're right." Robert slipped his phone back into his pocket. "But, Mrs. Chen, being right doesn't guarantee winning. Not against someone like Richard Thornton." The looseness tightened again immediately. "What do you mean?" Robert's expression was sympathetic but realistic. He has resources, time, money, legal knowledge from his career. And based on what Helen told me about the Frank Morrison situation, he has no shame about using all of it. He'll bury you in paperwork, threaten legal action, drag this out as long as possible, hoping you'll give up. "Can you stop him?" Maggie asked. The question felt small, powerless. "I can fight him," Robert said, "but I need you to understand what that means. Legal fees, stress, time. Richard will make this as difficult as possible. He'll file counter-complaints, he'll rally board members, he'll turn neighbors against you. Are you prepared for that?" Maggie thought about the podcast, about December 15th, about Daniel's voice on those recordings asking questions, drawing out stories, giving people space to be heard. She thought about Sarah's text, about time, her daughter had said, about time her mother stopped being quiet. I don't know if I'm prepared, she said honestly, but I need to try. Robert nodded. That's all I needed to hear. He pulled out his phone again, made a call. When someone answered, he said, "This is Robert Kim. I need to file an emergency complaint with utilities enforcement. Unauthorized interference with permitted residential equipment." He rattled off details: address, permit number, nature of the interference. The person on the other end must have asked questions because Robert paused, listened, then said, "Yes, I'll hold." While he waited, he looked at Maggie. "An inspector will come today. They take this seriously. Interference with utility access is a safety issue. If that lock is creating any kind of service disruption, they'll red tag it." "What does that mean?" Maggie asked. "It means Richard can't touch it, not legally. If he does, it becomes a criminal matter, not just civil." The voice on the phone came back. Robert confirmed a few more details, thanked them, and hung up. "Inspector Santos will be here within 2 hours." He looked at Maggie. "Do you have the original permits? Any documentation about the installation?" Inside, Maggie showed him Daniel's filing system. Every permit, every inspection report, every piece of correspondence with the city. Robert photographed each page, organized them into a digital folder on his laptop. His efficiency was calming. This was what he did. This was his expertise. She did not have to know how to fight this battle. She just had to let someone who did know fight it for her. Except that was not quite right either. Because Robert could handle the legal aspects, but she would have to handle everything else: the neighbors, the pressure, the confrontations, the daily reality of living across the street from a man who wanted to break her. Robert must have seen something in her face because he said, "Mrs. Chen, I know this is overwhelming, but you're not alone in this. Helen is behind you. I'm behind you. And from what I know about your husband's podcast project, there's a whole community waiting for those stories. You're not fighting just for yourself." After Robert left, Maggie tried to work on the podcast. She had uploaded the backup files to an external drive before the internet had gone down, so she had access to the raw audio. But editing without being able to check the online guides she usually consulted felt like working with one hand tied behind her back. She made progress, but it was slow. Frustratingly slow. The kind of slow that made the deadline feel less like a goal and more like a cliff she was driving toward at speed. At 10:43, a white city truck pulled into her driveway. The vehicle had seen hard use: dents in the bumper, faded decals on the doors. The logo was barely legible: City of Pinehurst Utilities Department. A man got out, late 40s, Hispanic, wearing work clothes and carrying a tablet. He had the weathered look of someone who spent most of his time outside dealing with problems. "Mrs. Chen," he called out, "I'm Inspector Kevin Santos." She met him on the lawn. "Thank you for coming so quickly." He waved off her thanks. "Interference with utility access gets priority response. Where's the equipment?" She led him around to the side of the house. He examined the lock with the same careful attention Robert had, but with the added expertise of someone who knew exactly what he was looking at. He checked the city permit sticker, cross-referenced it with something on his tablet, took photos, made notes. "Who installed this lock?" he asked. "The HOA president, Richard Thornton." Santos's expression changed, just slightly, a tightening around the eyes, a set to his jaw. "Mr. Thornton from Pinehurst Estates?" "Yes. Do you know him?" Santos was quiet for a moment. His expression changed in a way that suggested he was choosing his words carefully, weighing what he could say officially versus what he knew personally. Then he said, "I know of him. He's filed 63 complaints with our department in the last 6 years." The number hit Maggie like a physical thing. Her breath caught. 63? Average H. OA president files maybe 10 complaints in that time frame, usually legitimate issues, code violations, actual safety hazards, things that need city intervention. Santos tapped his tablet, scrolling through what looked like a long list. Mr. Thornton's complaints are different in their volume, different in their targets, different in their outcomes. He turned the tablet so she could see. A spreadsheet filled with dates and addresses and complaint types and resolutions. Most of the resolution column read the same thing: unfounded, no action required, dismissed. 94% of his complaints result in no enforcement action, Santos said. That's not normal. That's not even close to normal. That's someone using the complaint system as a weapon. So he just files complaints to harass people? Maggie asked. Her voice was barely above a whisper. Santos looked at her directly. His eyes were kind, but his expression was serious. Ma'am, I can't make that determination officially. But I can tell you this. In 20 years doing this job, I've seen every kind of HOA president, the ones who actually care about safety, the ones who are power-hungry but at least follow rules, the ones who are incompetent but well-meaning. He paused. And then there are the ones like Mr. Thornton, the ones who understand just enough about regulations to weaponize them, who know exactly how far they can push before it becomes legally actionable, who target people they think won't fight back, and who stop just short of anything that would get them in real trouble. You've dealt with him before, Maggie said. Not a question. Santos nodded. Frank Morrison, 3 years ago. I inspected his property 14 times in 18 months. Every inspection requested by Mr. Thornton, every single one came back clean. No violations, no hazards, nothing. But that didn't stop the complaints. Mr. Morrison tried to get a restraining order against further inspections. We couldn't grant it. HOA presidents have the right to file complaints, even baseless ones. Maggie felt something cold settle in her stomach. Frank Morrison, who had jumped off a bridge, who Helen had described as broken by Richard's relentless harassment. The system that should have protected him had instead enabled his tormentor. I'm sorry I couldn't do more for him, Santos said quietly. The law doesn't give us tools to stop this kind of abuse. All we can do is document, investigate, issue citations when violations actually exist. But we can't stop someone from filing complaints, even when the pattern is clear. But you can stop this, Maggie said, gesturing to the lock. Yes, Santos said. He pulled a red tag from his truck. This I can stop, because this crosses a line. This isn't filing a complaint about a potential violation. This is direct interference with permitted infrastructure. This is taking action without authority. This is something I have clear jurisdiction over. He filled out the form with careful precision. Each line completed, each box checked. The bureaucratic ritual of official power being properly exercised. When he finished, he read it aloud. Unauthorized interference with permitted utility infrastructure located at residential property. Installation of locking mechanism without permit or authorization. Immediate cessation of activity required. Removal of unauthorized equipment pending investigation and hearing. He affixed the red tag directly over the orange sticker Richard had placed. The symbolism was deliberate, and Maggie felt it viscerally. Official authority replacing fake authority. Real consequences replacing empty threats. The law, imperfect as it was, finally working the way it was supposed to. He pulled a red tag from his truck. Official city form, heavy paper, legal language in small print. I'm issuing a stop work order on this lock installation. He filled out the form carefully, deliberately. Unauthorized interference with permitted utility infrastructure. Immediate cessation of activity required. Pending full investigation. He affixed the red tag directly over the orange sticker Richard had placed. The symbolism was not lost on Maggie. Official authority replacing fake authority. Real consequences replacing empty threats. What happens now? She asked. Mr. Thornton will receive notification. He'll be required to attend a hearing. Depending on the findings, there could be fines. He looked at her seriously. Mrs. Chen, this tag means he cannot touch this lock. If he removes it, if he tampers with the tag, it escalates to criminal interference. Do you understand? Yes. Good. Santos handed her a card. That's my direct line. If anything changes, if you see him near this box, you call me immediately. After he left, Maggie stood looking at the red tag. It fluttered slightly in the breeze that was picking up as the storm clouds gathered. She felt a complicated mix of relief and dread. Relief that someone official had confirmed she was right. Dread about what Richard would do next. She did not have to wait long. At 11:15, her doorbell rang. She looked through the peephole and saw Richard standing on her porch. He was not alone. A man in an expensive suit stood beside him, mid-60s, silver-haired, the kind of polished professional appearance that cost money to maintain. Richard's clipboard was gone. His casual condescension was gone. What remained was cold, focused anger barely contained beneath a veneer of civility. Maggie opened the door but did not invite them in. Richard gestured to the man beside him. "This is Marcus Webb, my attorney." "Mrs. Chen." Marcus extended his hand. She did not take it. He withdrew it smoothly, unbothered. "We're here as a courtesy, to discuss resolution options before this situation becomes complicated." "It's already complicated," Maggie said. Her voice shook slightly but held. "You locked my utilities without permission. The city has confirmed it's a violation." Richard's jaw tightened. "Margaret, you've escalated a simple procedural matter into a legal issue. That was unnecessary." "It was necessary when you refused to remove the lock." Marcus pulled a document from his briefcase. "Mrs. Chen, we're prepared to offer a settlement, full restoration of access in exchange for your agreement not to pursue further complaints or legal action." "What about the underlying issue?" Maggie asked. "What stops this from happening again?" "The HOA will conduct a proper review," Marcus said smoothly. "With your cooperation, all above board, all properly documented." Maggie thought about what Robert had said. About Richard burying people in paperwork. About dragging things out. This settlement would end it quickly. Restore her internet. Let her finish the podcast. Return to the quiet life she had been living before the lock appeared. But it would also mean accepting that Richard could do this. That he had the authority to interfere, and she had to negotiate for the restoration of her own rights. That he could lock her utilities, and her only recourse was to agree not to complain about it. She thought about Frank Morrison. About the $18,000 in legal fees Helen had mentioned. About Frank feeling like he was drowning. About Richard pushing his head underwater again and again until Frank could not surface anymore. "No," Maggie said. Richard's expression darkened. "No? No settlement. The city is investigating. I'll cooperate with their process." Marcus's professional courtesy slipped just slightly. "Mrs. Chen, you should understand that fighting this will be expensive, time-consuming. The association has significant resources." "So do I," Maggie lied. She had Robert, she had Helen. She had her own stubbornness that was surprising her with its sudden appearance after 53 years of accommodation. Richard stepped closer, close enough that it felt aggressive. "This is a mistake, Margaret." She met his eyes. "Maybe, but it's my mistake to make." After they left, she closed the door and leaned against it, shaking, not from fear, from adrenaline, from the unfamiliar sensation of confrontation. She had said no, had refused to back down, had stood her ground against two men who were accustomed to people folding. Her phone buzzed. Text from Helen. "I saw Richard's car, you okay?" Maggie typed back. "I said no to his settlement offer." The response came immediately. "Good. Then, can I come over?" Bringing Emma. 20 minutes later, Helen arrived with a younger woman in tow. Emma Rodriguez, early 30s, carrying a toddler on her hip. Maggie recognized her vaguely. The family 4 houses down. She had brought cookies after Daniel's funeral, had not stayed long, had seemed nervous. "Emma wanted to meet you," Helen said. "Tell her, Emma." Emma shifted her daughter to the other hip. The child was maybe 2, dark curls, solemn eyes. "Richard cited me 11 times last year," Emma said quietly. "My lawn, my car, my kids' toys. He said I was bringing down property values." Maggie invited them in. They sat in the living room, Emma's daughter exploring the coffee table with the fearless curiosity of toddlerhood. Emma told her story. Single mother, working 2 jobs, trying to maintain a house and raise kids and keep everything together. Richard's constant violations had felt like persecution, like being targeted for not being perfect enough, for not having a husband to handle the yard work, for not having money to hire professionals for every little thing. "I thought about moving," Emma said, "selling at a loss, starting over somewhere else. But I can't afford that. This is my home, my kids' home." Did you fight back?" Maggie asked. Emma laughed bitterly. "With what? I can't afford a lawyer. I barely make rent." "So I just tried to comply. Cut the grass shorter, moved my car, put the toys away. But it was never enough. There was always something else." The doorbell rang again. This time it was Patricia Reeves, the Realtor board member who had been with Richard at the initial confrontation. She looked nervous, kept glancing over her shoulder like Richard might appear at any moment. "I shouldn't be here," Patricia said, "but I can't keep quiet anymore." She sat on the edge of the couch, hands clasped tight in her lap. "I voted against the lock," she said. "When Richard proposed it at the board meeting, I said it was overreach, that we didn't have authority." "What did Richard say?" Maggie asked. that I didn't understand the liability issues, that I was being naive. She looked at Maggie. The other board members went along with him. They always do. Richard has been president for 6 years. He knows the bylaws better than anyone. He knows how to make things sound reasonable even when they're not. Why are you telling me this? Maggie asked. Because I'm tired of being a coward. Patricia's voice cracked slightly. I watched what he did to Frank Morrison. I watched Frank break down, lose everything, and I did nothing. I told myself it wasn't my business, that I couldn't afford to make enemies on the board because I need those connections for my real estate business. I chose my career over doing the right thing. She pulled an envelope from her purse. These are copies of the board meeting minutes, the ones where Richard proposed various actions over the years. She pushed it across the coffee table to Maggie. You'll see a pattern. He targets specific people, usually women, usually people he thinks won't fight back. Maggie opened the envelope. Inside were printed pages, board minutes from the last 3 years. She scanned through them. Frank Morrison's name appeared repeatedly. Violations, citations, discussions about escalating enforcement, and other names, women's names mostly. Emma Rodriguez, Lisa Chen, no relation. Maria Gonzalez, each one appearing in multiple meetings, each one cited for increasingly trivial violations. This is systematic, Maggie said. Yes, Patricia replied, and I helped him do it by staying quiet. The 4 women sat in silence for a moment. Helen, who had lost her husband to Richard's harassment. Emma, who was being targeted right now. Patricia, who had enabled it through her silence. And Maggie, who was just beginning to understand the scope of what she was fighting. We need to document everything, Helen said finally. Every violation Richard has issued. Every complaint. Every person he's targeted. Build a case that shows this isn't about one utility box. It's about a pattern of abuse. I can help with that, Patricia said. I have access to old board records, communications, emails. Emma pulled out her phone. I've kept every violation notice he sent me, photographed them all, just in case. Maggie looked at these 3 women, different ages, different backgrounds, different reasons for being here, but united by the experience of being on the wrong side of Richard Thornton's need for control. An alliance was forming, not planned, not organized, just organic solidarity born from shared experience. Her phone rang. She glanced at the screen. Sarah, her daughter. Maggie excused herself and went into the kitchen to answer. Sarah's face appeared on the video call. She was in her apartment across the country, visible behind her the neat minimalist decor that was so unlike the cluttered warmth of the house Maggie still lived in. Mom, I saw your text about fighting the HOA thing. Are you serious? Yes, Maggie said, I'm serious. Sarah's expression was complicated, part relief, part concern, part something else Maggie could not quite identify. Mom, do you know what you're getting into? These fights can drag on for years. I know. You'll need a lawyer. Money, time. Sarah's voice rose slightly. You can barely finish Dad's podcast. How are you going to manage a legal battle? The words stung because they were true, or had been true. Maggie was barely managing, was overwhelmed by the podcast deadline, was drowning in grief and indecision and the weight of promises she did not know how to keep. But something had changed in the last 48 hours. Something had shifted when she found that lock. When she called Robert, when she said no to Richard's settlement offer, when she opened her door to these women who were sitting in her living room right now building an alliance. I'm managing, Maggie said quietly. I have help. Sarah was silent for a moment. Then she said, Is this really about the internet? Or is this about something else? Maggie thought about how to answer that, about how to explain that yes, it was about the internet and the podcast and Daniel's legacy. But it was also about 53 years of making herself smaller, about letting doctors dismiss her concerns until it was too late, about watching her husband die and feeling like maybe if she had been braver, louder, more demanding, he might still be here. It's about not being quiet anymore, Maggie said finally. Sarah's eyes filled with tears. Oh, Mom, I know I should have done this years ago, Maggie continued. I know I should have fought for your father. I know you're angry about that. You have a right to be. Sarah wiped her eyes. I'm not angry. Not anymore. I was. But I'm not. She took a shaky breath. I just don't want to watch you get hurt. I'm already hurt, Maggie said. I've been hurt for 8 months. Maybe longer. Maybe my whole life. Fighting might hurt too. But at least it's a different kind of hurt. They talked for another 10 minutes. About logistics, about the podcast deadline, about whether Maggie should really be taking this on right now when she was still grieving. But underneath the practical concerns, something else was happening. A reconnection. A thawing of the distance that had grown between them since Daniel's death. When Maggie returned to the living room, the other women had organized themselves. Helen had a legal pad covered in notes. Patricia had her laptop open, scrolling through files. Emma's daughter had fallen asleep on the couch, thumb in mouth, the picture of peaceful innocence. We need you to tell us everything Richard has done, Helen said. Every interaction, every threat, everything. So Maggie did. She told them about the confrontation, about his condescension, about Marcus Webb and the settlement offer, about Richard standing too close, trying to intimidate her through proximity, about the orange sticker that was not official, about his claim that he was protecting community safety when really he was just exercising control. Patricia made notes, cross-referenced with board minutes, found patterns. Richard had proposed the utility oversight measure 6 months ago, right after Daniel's death, had waited a respectful interval, then pushed it through when Maggie was too deep in grief to notice or care. He planned this, Patricia said. This wasn't spontaneous. He's been waiting for the right moment. The realization settled over Maggie like cold water. Richard had not just seized an opportunity, he had created one, had watched her husband die and calculated how long to wait before moving against the widow, how long before grief would make her vulnerable enough to not fight back. That evening, there was an emergency HOA meeting. Mandatory attendance, the email had said. Maggie almost did not go, almost stayed home with the doors locked and the curtains drawn. But Helen knocked on her door at 6:30, dressed for battle in a blazer and slacks, and said, "We're going together. You're not facing him alone." The community clubhouse was packed, 80 residents crammed into a space designed for 50. The air was thick with body heat and tension, and the peculiar electricity that comes when a community is about to fracture along fault lines that have been forming for years. Maggie recognized most of them from neighborhood gatherings, friendly waves at the mailbox, polite conversation at the annual summer barbecue, small talk about weather and gardens, and the inconsequential surface pleasantries that held suburban life together. Now they looked at her with expressions ranging from curiosity to sympathy to outright hostility. She could read the division in their postures. Those who sat near the front, arms crossed, faces set in the disapproving expressions of people who had already decided she was the problem. Those who sat in the middle, uncertain, looking between Richard at the podium and Maggie near the back, trying to figure out which side represented their own interests. And those few scattered throughout who met her eyes with something that might have been solidarity or might have been pity. Richard stood at the front of the room behind a small podium that elevated him 6 inches above everyone else. He had Gerald Shue and 2 other board members with him. They sat at a table that was positioned to create a clear visual hierarchy. The board above, the residents below, the architecture of authority made manifest in furniture arrangement. Monica Reeves was notably absent. Maggie wondered if that was significant. If Monica had finally drawn a line, or if Richard had pushed her out the way he pushed out anyone who questioned him. She noticed Patricia sitting in the back row, 3 seats away from her. Patricia looked like she wanted to disappear into the wall, present but trying not to be seen, walking the impossible line between conscience and self-preservation. Richard called the meeting to order with practiced efficiency. He had done this hundreds of times, knew exactly how to project authority, how to control the room, how to make his voice carry without shouting, how to use silence and timing to maximum effect. We're here to address a situation that has unfortunately escalated beyond reason, he began. His voice was calm, measured, the voice of a reasonable man dealing with an unreasonable situation. Mrs. Chen has chosen to involve city officials in what should have been an internal matter. This decision affects all of us. City oversight of our internal governance sets a dangerous precedent. It undermines the autonomy we've worked hard to maintain. It opens the door to external interference in how we manage our community. He framed it perfectly. made it about community independence rather than his own overreach, made Maggie the problem rather than his unauthorized lock, made this about principle instead of power. Several residents nodded along. She could see it happening, the narrative taking hold. Richard's version of events becoming the accepted truth, simply through the authority with which it was delivered. "We have bylaws for a reason," Richard continued. "We have procedures. We have a structure that has served this community well for many years. When one resident decides that structure doesn't apply to them, when they decide to run to outside authorities rather than working within our system, it weakens us all." More nods, more agreement. Maggie felt herself shrinking in her seat, the old familiar impulse to make herself smaller, to not make waves, to accept that maybe she had handled this wrong, that maybe she should have worked within the system even though the system was controlled by the person who had wronged her. "Mrs. Chen," Richard said, his voice taking on a tone of magnanimous patience. His hand gestured toward her with the kind of theatrical grace that comes from years of courtroom performance. "Would you like to explain your actions to your neighbors?" The room turned, 80 pairs of eyes, all focused on her, waiting, expecting her to shrink, to apologize, to back down the way quiet women were supposed to back down when they overstepped. Maggie's heart hammered in her chest. Her hands were shaking so badly she had to clasp them together to hide it. Her mouth was dry. Every instinct screamed at her to make this go away, to smooth it over, to apologize and retreat, and let Richard have his victory. But then she thought about Daniel, about his voice on those podcast recordings, patient, encouraging, making space for other people to find their own words. She thought about Mrs. Kim saying thank you for the tea, about Daniel saying you can tell her yourself, she's right here, about being present but invisible, about being there but not being heard. She thought about Frank Morrison driving to that bridge, about Emma Rodriguez checking her mailbox every morning in fear of what violation would be waiting, about all the ways silence enabled cruelty to continue unchallenged. She stood, slowly. Her legs felt unsteady beneath her, but she stood. "Mr. Thornton locked my utility box without authorization," she said. Her voice was quiet, quieter than she wanted it to be, but it carried in the silent room. "He interfered with my internet access, my power monitoring, my ability to complete work that has a deadline. When I asked him to remove it, he refused. When I asked who had authorized it, he gave vague answers. When I asked how long it would be locked, he said indefinitely." She paused, breathed, continued. "So I did what any homeowner would do. I checked my permits. I contacted the city. I asked for an inspection. The city confirmed what I already knew. The lock was installed without authorization. It violated city code. It interfered with permitted infrastructure. It was a safety measure," Richard interjected smoothly. His voice carried the weight of expertise, of someone who understood complicated matters that the simple widow did not. And that was the moment, the precise instant when something inside Maggie shifted from fear to anger, from accommodation to refusal. Maggie surprised herself with the firmness of that single word. It was a control measure. Richard's expression hardened. "Mrs. Chen, you don't understand the complexities of HOA governance." And there it was. The dismissal, the condescension, the assumption that she was too simple, too emotional, too female to understand complicated matters. Something broke open inside Maggie. Or maybe something that had been broken finally aligned back into place. "Don't," she said. Her voice was stronger now. "Don't dismiss me because I'm a widow, because I'm quiet, because you think I won't fight back." She looked around the room, at the faces watching her, at Helen nodding encouragement, at Emma holding her daughter, at Patricia in the back row finally meeting her eyes. "My husband stood up to Mr. Thornton 6 months before he died," Maggie said. "Daniel told him no when Richard wanted to inspect our utility box. He refused to back down, and Richard told him he'd deal with it when the time was right." The room went very quiet. "My husband died, and 3 weeks later Richard had that box locked, not for safety, for revenge, because Daniel said no and Richard doesn't accept no." She pulled out the envelope Patricia had given her. "These are board meeting minutes. They show a pattern. Richard targets specific people, mostly women, mostly people he thinks won't fight back. He cites them repeatedly for trivial violations until they break or leave." She held up the pages. "Frank Morrison, 11 violations in 14 months. He killed himself. Emma Rodriguez. 11 violations in 8 months. She's a single mother trying to raise her kids. Lisa Chen. Maria Gonzalez. The list goes on. Richard stood. This is defamatory. It's documented, Maggie said. She felt tears on her face, but her voice did not waver. You use your position to bully people, to control them, to break them. And everyone lets you because they're afraid of being next. Helen stood. My husband Frank died because of this man's harassment. Emma stood, her daughter awake now and fussing. I've been cited 11 times for things my neighbors do without consequence. Patricia stood, visibly shaking. I've enabled this by staying quiet. I'm done being quiet. 3 women standing. Then a man near the front stood, Tom Martinez. Older, stern-faced. I've watched this board operate for 5 years, he said. I thought it was just thorough governance. Now I'm wondering if it's something else. Another woman stood. Then another man. Not everyone, but enough. Enough to show that Maggie was not alone, that Richard's control was not absolute, that silence could be broken. Richard's face was red. This is out of order. This meeting is adjourned. But no one moved. The room stayed full. The people stayed standing. Richard grabbed his papers and walked out. Gerald and the other board members followed, looking uncomfortable. After they left, the room erupted in conversation. People came up to Maggie, some to offer support, some to share their own stories of Richard's overreach, some to ask questions about what would happen next. Helen put an arm around Maggie's shoulders. You gave them voice, she said quietly, just like Daniel did with his podcast. Maggie could not speak, could only nod. The adrenaline was leaving her system, replaced by exhaustion and a strange kind of exhilaration. She had done it, had stood up, had spoken out, had broken 53 years of trained silence in one terrifying moment of confrontation. By the time she got home, it was past 9. The house was dark. She had forgotten to leave lights on, had not expected to be gone so long. The motion sensor triggered as she walked up the driveway, flooding the front yard with harsh white light that made the shadows beyond it seem darker by contrast. Her hands were still shaking, not from fear now, from the after effects of adrenaline, from the chemical aftermath of confrontation. Her body had been prepared for fight or flight, and she had chosen fight, and now it was trying to process what that meant. She sat in Daniel's office, unable to work, unable to settle, unable to do anything except replay the meeting in her head. The moment she had stood, the moment she had refused to be dismissed, the moment other people had stood with her. Helen, Emma, Patricia, Tom Martinez, others whose names she did not know but whose solidarity had felt like oxygen after years of holding her breath. The red tag on the utility box was visible through the window, lit by the motion sensor light that was still on. A small piece of paper that carried the weight of official authority. Proof that she had been right. Proof that standing up mattered. Proof that silence was not the only option. Her phone buzzed. Email from the city. Subject line: follow-up inspection scheduled. She opened it with hands that were beginning to steady. Expanded review initiated based on pattern of complaints. Inspector Santos assigned. Full property assessment requested by Utilities Enforcement Division. So it was not over. Was maybe just beginning. The city was taking this seriously. Was looking not just at her locked utility box, but at Richard's entire pattern of behavior. Then another email arrived. The notification sound made her flinch. From Marcus Webb, Richard's attorney. Subject line: notice of counter-complaint. She opened it with dread that sat heavy in her stomach like spoiled food. Inside was legal language that she had to read 3 times to fully understand. Claims of harassment, defamation, intentional infliction of emotional distress. Richard Thornton alleging that Margaret Chen had engaged in a campaign of malicious falsehoods designed to damage his reputation and undermine his authority as HOA president. The document ran to 4 pages. Dense paragraphs of legal terminology, references to statutes she had never heard of, demands for immediate cessation of all negative communications regarding Mr. Thornton, threats of civil action seeking damages in excess of $50,000, a laundry list of her alleged offenses, including, but not limited to, making false statements at a public meeting, filing frivolous complaints with city officials, and conspiring with other residents to defame the HOA board. The word conspiring stood out. as if talking to Helen and Emma and Patricia was some kind of criminal coordination, rather than people sharing their experiences. Richard was not just fighting back, he was escalating, turning her complaint into a weapon against her, using the legal system the way he used everything else, as a tool of intimidation. She forwarded the email to Robert with a message that she tried to keep steady and professional, but that came out shaky anyway. Richard has escalated, counter-complaint attached. What do we do now? The response came 5 minutes later. She could almost hear Robert's calm voice in the text. We fight. I'll handle the legal response. This is a classic SLAPP suit, strategic lawsuit against public participation. It's designed to silence you through the threat of expensive litigation. We'll file an anti-SLAPP motion. California has strong protections against this kind of abuse. Don't let him intimidate you. Then a second message. You did the right thing speaking up. Keep documenting everything. And focus on the podcast. Don't let him distract you from what matters. A knock at the door made her jump hard enough that she nearly dropped her phone. The motion sensor light had turned off. She could not see who was outside. For a moment she considered not answering, pretending she was not home, avoiding whatever this was. But she had just spent 2 hours refusing to be silent. She was not going to hide now. She looked through the peephole. Gerald Shue stood on her porch alone, the retired lawyer, the board member who had stood silently beside Richard through so much. He looked uncomfortable, kept glancing over his shoulder as if afraid of being seen. She opened the door. Mr. Shue, Mrs. Chen. He shifted his weight from foot to foot. I'm sorry to bother you so late. I know you must be exhausted. Can we talk? Off the record? She hesitated. Everything in her experience said not to trust board members. They had enabled Richard, had voted with him, had watched Frank Morrison's destruction and done nothing. But something in Gerald's expression made her step aside. A kind of shame that looked genuine. A discomfort that seemed more about himself than about the situation. She let him in, offered tea that he declined. They sat in the living room, the same room where this had all started yesterday when Helen had told her about Frank. Was it only yesterday? It felt like years. Gerald sat on the edge of the couch, nervous energy radiating off him like heat. He could not seem to get comfortable, kept adjusting his position, crossing and uncrossing his legs. Hands clasped, then unclasped, then clasped again. I owe you an apology, he said finally. The words came out in a rush like he had been holding them in and they were escaping under pressure. I've known about Richard's pattern for years. I've watched him target people. I've advised against many of his actions, but I never pushed hard enough, never took a real stand, never did what I should have done. Why not? Maggie asked. She kept her voice neutral, not accusing, just asking. Gerald looked at his hands. Because I'm 70 years old, and I thought I'd earned a quiet retirement. Because I spent 40 years practicing law and dealing with conflict, and I was tired. Because challenging Richard meant more conflict, and I just wanted peace. Because I told myself that as long as I voted the right way in private meetings, as long as I raised objections that got noted in the minutes, I'd done enough. He looked up at her. His eyes were wet, but I was wrong. Because my private votes didn't stop him. My quiet objections didn't help Frank Morrison or Emma Rodriguez or you. My careful documentation of my disagreement meant nothing because I never backed it up with action. I enabled Richard through my silence, just as much as Monica or the others enabled him through their agreement. Maggie did not know what to say. This man had been part of the system that had hurt so many people. But he was also clearly carrying the weight of that participation, was clearly struggling with his own complicity. Why are you here now? She asked finally. Because you did what I should have done years ago. You stood up. Gerald pulled a manila envelope from inside his jacket, thick, heavy with paper. This is everything I have on the Frank Morrison case. Communications between Frank and Richard, board meeting minutes, emails, violation notices, legal correspondence, all of it. He set the envelope on the coffee table between them, with the careful deliberation of someone performing a ritual of atonement. Richard's pattern was clear even then. He filed complaint after complaint, violation after violation. I documented every objection I raised, every time I said this was excessive, every time I warned that we were exposing the association to liability. But I never took it further than internal objections, never went to the authorities. never help Frank fight back. Why not? Maggie asked again. Gerald was quiet for a long moment. Because Frank was abrasive, difficult, not easy to like. He yelled at board meetings, sent angry emails, made threats that were probably empty but sounded serious. And I told myself that he was partly to blame for the situation. That if he had just been more reasonable, more willing to compromise, Richard would have backed off. He met her eyes. I was wrong about that too. Richard doesn't back off when people are reasonable. He backs off when people fight back hard enough to make continuing more costly than it's worth. But Frank fought alone, and I let him fight alone. And when he died, I told myself it wasn't my fault because I'd raised objections. I'd documented my concerns. I'd done what I could within the limits I'd set for myself. But those limits were the problem, weren't they? Maggie said quietly. Yes. Gerald's voice broke slightly. Those limits were cowardice dressed up as prudence. They were self-protection disguised as propriety. And Frank Morrison died while I was protecting myself. He set the envelope on the coffee table. Helen told me about her nephew, Robert Kim. Get this to him. It shows Richard has done this before. That he targets vulnerable people. That he doesn't stop until they break. Thank you, Maggie said. Gerald stood to leave, then paused at the door. Mrs. Chen, Richard won't let this go. He'll escalate. He'll make your life difficult. Are you prepared for that? Maggie thought about Daniel, about the podcast, about Sarah's text, about time, about 53 years of not being prepared and choosing to try anyway. I don't know, she said honestly, but I'm not backing down. After Gerald left, Maggie sat in the quiet house. The counter complaint was still open on her phone. Legal threats in formal language, the kind designed to intimidate, to make her believe she was in over her head, that fighting back would cost more than it was worth. She forwarded it to Robert, added a note. Richard has escalated. What do we do now? The response came 5 minutes later. We fight. I'll handle the legal response. You focus on the podcast. Don't let him distract you from what matters. She looked at the laptop, at the podcast files, at the deadline that was now 4 weeks and 6 days away, at interview 44 that still needed editing, at 3 more interviews that needed to be completed, at Daniel's project that was the only thing giving these terrible days structure and purpose. The internet was still down. The mobile hotspot was too slow. She had no way to upload files, to consult guides, to do the work that needed doing. But she could edit, could shape the audio, could build the episodes piece by piece. And when the internet was restored, when Richard was dealt with, when this battle was won or lost, she would be ready. She opened the editing software, clicked on interview 44. Mrs. Kim's voice filled the small office, telling the story of coming to America with nothing, building a life through determination and hard work, and refusing to be invisible. Maggie listened, and as she listened, she edited, trimming pauses, adjusting levels, shaping the story, finding the rhythm, doing the work Daniel had taught her by example, giving voice to someone who deserved to be heard. By midnight, she had finished the first draft of episode 44. It was not perfect, but it was done. 1 episode closer to the finish line. 1 promise kept in a long line of promises still waiting. She saved the file, backed it up, made notes about what still needed work. Then she sat back in Daniel's chair and allowed herself to feel what the last 48 hours had been. Terror, adrenaline, confrontation, alliance, voice. All of it swirling together into something that felt like forward motion, even though she could not see where the path led. Across the street, Richard's house was dark. He was probably awake too, probably planning his next move, probably confident that eventually she would break. But Maggie had learned something tonight, in that packed room full of neighbors, in that moment when she had stood and spoken and refused to be dismissed. She had learned that silence was a choice, that voice was a choice, that breaking could also be breaking open instead of breaking down. Tomorrow would bring more challenges, more pressure, more confrontation. Richard's counter-complaint would require response. The city investigation would continue. The podcast deadline would loom closer. But tonight, she sat in her dead husband's chair, editing his project, carrying his legacy forward. And for the first time in 8 months, she felt like she was doing more than just surviving. She was fighting, and fighting felt like the first step toward living. The certified letter arrived 3 days after the community meeting. Maggie saw it in the mailbox when she went out to check at noon, the thick manila envelope wedged between grocery store circulars and credit card offers. The return address was printed in formal business font. Webb and Associates, Attorneys at Law, Suite 1200, downtown Sacramento. The kind of address that announced itself as expensive before you even knew what was inside. She carried it inside like it was something that might detonate, set it on the kitchen counter next to her cold coffee, stared at it for 10 minutes before she found the courage to open it. Her hand shook as she broke the seal. The envelope was heavy, professional-grade paper, the kind of weight that announced itself as serious business before you even read the words. Inside was a formal legal document, multiple pages thick. The first page had a header in bold letters that seemed to grow larger the longer she looked at it. Cease and desist letter. Below that, in smaller but equally intimidating print, demand for retraction and apology. She sat down at the kitchen table and forced herself to read. Richard Thornton, by and through his attorneys of record, Webb and Associates, hereby demands that Margaret Chen immediately cease and desist from all defamatory communications, false statements, malicious accusations, and coordinated harassment regarding Mr. Thornton's character, professional reputation, and conduct as duly elected president of the Pinehurst Estates Homeowners Association. The language was designed to overwhelm, to make simple things sound criminal through the addition of legal modifiers. What she had called speaking up, they called defamatory communications. What she had called telling the truth, they called false statements. What she had called talking to neighbors, they called coordinated harassment. Said communications include, but are not limited to, making knowingly false statements at the community meeting of October 23rd regarding Mr. Thornton's conduct, motivations, and administrative actions, filing frivolous and malicious complaints with city officials designed to harass and damage Mr. Thornton's reputation, conspiring with other residents, including but not limited to Helen Morrison, Emma Rodriguez, and Patricia Reeves, to organize a campaign of defamation against Mr. Thornton, and making public accusations that Mr. Thornton engaged in harassment, abuse of authority, and actions that contributed to the suicide of Frank Morrison. The word conspiracy appeared again and again, as if every conversation she had was part of some elaborate criminal plot, as if talking to Helen about shared experiences was racketeering, as if Emma sharing her violation notices was witness tampering. The legal language transformed ordinary human connection into something sinister. Maggie kept reading, each paragraph worse than the last. These false and defamatory statements have caused significant harm to Mr. Thornton's reputation, professional standing, and emotional well-being. Mr. Thornton has served the Pinehurst Estates community with distinction for 6 years, dedicating countless volunteer hours to maintaining community standards and property values. Mrs. Chen's malicious campaign has subjected him to public humiliation, damaged his standing in professional circles, and caused severe emotional distress, including anxiety, insomnia, and reputational harm that may be permanent. She almost laughed at that. Richard claiming anxiety and insomnia. Richard claiming to be the victim. Richard, who had driven Frank Morrison to suicide, claiming that being called out for it had caused him emotional distress. But the laughter died when she reached the next section. Failure to comply with this demand will result in immediate legal action. Mr. Thornton will seek damages including, but not limited to, $15,000 in compensatory damages for harm to reputation and emotional distress, punitive damages in an amount to be determined at trial, but not less than $25,000, costs of litigation including reasonable attorney's fees estimated at $10,000, and injunctive relief preventing further harassing conduct, $15,000 in compensatory damages, $25,000 in punitive, $10,000 in legal fees, $50,000 total. The numbers swam in front of her eyes. She read them again to make sure she had understood correctly. $50,000. She did not have $50,000. She had Daniel's life insurance money, most of which was earmarked for maintaining the house and living expenses. She had her modest retirement savings from her teaching career. She had the house itself, paid off but needing repairs. $50,000 would wipe out everything Daniel had left her, would force her to sell the house, would destroy the small financial security she had left. The letter continued with a detailed list of specific statements she was required to retract, each one numbered, each one with the date and location it was allegedly made. It was thorough, methodical. Someone had taken notes at the community meeting, had documented every word she said, had prepared this retaliation with careful precision. Statement requiring retraction number 1. That Mr. Thornton locked Mrs. Chen's utility box in retaliation for her late husband's refusal to submit to inspection. Truth. Mr. Thornton secured community infrastructure in accordance with HOA safety protocols and proper authority. Statement requiring retraction number 2. That Mr. Thornton engaged in a pattern of harassment targeting Frank Morrison. Truth. Mr. Thornton properly enforced community standards through legitimate citation of documented violations. Statement requiring retraction. Number 3. That Mr. Thornton's actions contributed to Frank Morrison's suicide. Truth. Mr. Morrison's tragic death was the result of mental health issues unrelated to legitimate HOA governance. On and on. 14 statements total. Each true thing she had said reframed as a lie requiring retraction. Each documented fact rewritten as malicious fiction. The letter was not just a legal threat. It was gaslighting in formal language, an attempt to make her doubt her own memory of events, to make her question whether what she knew to be true was really true. At the bottom of the final page, a signature in blue ink, Marcus Webb, attorney at law. And below that, in bold letters, the deadline. You have 5 business days from receipt of this letter to comply with the following demands. 1. Written retraction of all false statements to be published in the neighborhood newsletter and group chat. 2. Written apology to Mr. Thornton acknowledging the harm caused. 3. Agreement to refrain from all future communications regarding Mr. Thornton. 4. Payment of $5,000 in immediate damages as good faith demonstration of seriousness. 5 business days. Today was Friday. That meant by the following Friday, she had to publicly humiliate herself, admit to lying when she had told the truth, apologize to the man who was trying to destroy her, and pay him $5,000 for the privilege, or face a lawsuit that could take everything she had left. She called Robert. Her hands were shaking so badly, she almost dropped the phone twice before he answered. "He got the letter too," Robert said before she could speak. "Same firm sent me a copy. It's standard intimidation. Slap suit territory. Don't panic." $15,000, Maggie said. Her voice sounded hollow. "I don't have that." "You won't need it." Robert's voice was calm, steady, the kind of steady that came from having seen this tactic before and knowing how to counter it. "This is a threat, not a lawsuit. He's trying to scare you into backing down before we get to the city hearing. California has strong anti-slap statutes. If he actually files, we'll get it dismissed and he'll owe you attorney's fees." "But what if he does file? What if I lose?" "You won't lose. The statements you made are protected speech. You were reporting legitimate concerns at a community meeting. That's textbook protected activity." Robert paused. "Maggie, this is what he does. He uses legal threats to silence people. Frank Morrison faced the same thing. So did the others. Most of them backed down because they couldn't afford to fight. That's what he's counting on." "So what do I do?" "Nothing. Don't respond, don't retract, don't engage. Let me handle it. I'll send a response telling them to pound sand in more professional language. And we keep moving forward with the city investigation." After she hung up, Maggie sat at the kitchen table with the letter spread out in front of her. 5 pages of threats wrapped in legal formality. The language was designed to intimidate, to make her feel small and powerless and wrong, to make her doubt her own memory of events, to make her question whether standing up had been worth it. Her phone buzzed. Text from Helen. "Can I come over? I have something you need to hear." 20 minutes later, Helen arrived carrying a laptop and a USB drive. Her expression was grim, determined, the look of someone who had been carrying a burden for so long that it had become part of her skeleton, and was finally ready to set it down, even though the relief would hurt almost as much as the carrying had. They sat in the living room, the same room where this had all started, where Helen had first told her about Frank, where the alliance had formed, where everything had changed. Helen opened the laptop with hands that trembled slightly. Age or emotion, Maggie could not tell. Probably both. She inserted the USB drive, navigated through folders with the careful deliberation of someone who was not entirely comfortable with technology, but had learned enough to manage, found the file she was looking for. Audio file. The file name was just a date, 3 years ago. October 8th, 2 weeks before Frank Morrison died. I found this after Frank passed, Helen said quietly. Her voice was steady, but only through visible effort. On his computer, hidden in a folder inside another folder, like he knew it was important but couldn't bear to look at it. Or maybe he was saving it. For what? I don't know, evidence that never got used. Proof that got buried with him. She paused. Her finger hovered over the play button. For 2 years, I couldn't listen to it. I knew it was there. I'd transferred it to this drive. Backed it up, kept it safe. But I couldn't make myself click play. Couldn't bear to hear his voice. Couldn't face what I knew it would contain. What changed? Maggie asked softly. You did. Helen's eyes met hers. Watching you stand up at that meeting, watching you refuse to back down, watching you do what I should have helped Frank do. It made me realize that keeping this hidden was letting Richard win, was letting Frank's death mean nothing, was choosing my own comfort over justice. She clicked play. The audio was scratchy at first, the sound of a phone being positioned, background noise of a quiet house. Then Frank's voice came through, older than Maggie had imagined. Tired, but not weak. Not yet. This was Frank before the final breaking, before the bridge. This was Frank still trying, still hoping that reason might prevail, still believing that if he just explained himself clearly enough, Richard would understand, would relent, would show mercy. Mr. Thornton, I'm calling to ask you to stop. Please. I've tried to comply with everything you've asked for. The fence is cut down, the shed is moved, the mailbox is replaced. I've spent $9,000 on these changes. I've done everything you demanded. I'm asking you, as one neighbor to another, to please let this be enough. The desperation in his voice was hard to hear. This was a man begging. A man who had spent 40 years building a retirement savings and had watched it drain away over the height of a fence and the shade of a mailbox. A man who understood he was being broken, but could not figure out how to stop it. Richard's voice came next, calm, measured, perfectly reasonable in tone, but terrible in content. The contrast was jarring. Frank sounded like he was drowning. Richard sounded like he was discussing the weather. Mr. Morrison, I appreciate your frustration. I do. But compliance with community standards isn't optional. It's not something you do once and then you're done. It's ongoing. It's continuous. It's part of living in a community with standards. But I am complying, Frank said. His voice cracked slightly. I've fixed everything you cited. There's nothing left to fix. That's not accurate, Richard replied smoothly. There are ongoing concerns. Your lawn maintenance is inconsistent. Your vehicle is parked at an angle that exceeds the permitted deviation from parallel. Your trash bins are visible from the street on non-collection days. These are all documented violations. Those are new, Frank said. You never mentioned those before. I'm mentioning them now. Richard's voice never changed, never rose, never fell. Just maintained that same level tone that made everything sound reasonable even when it was insane. And they need to be addressed. That's how community standards work. We don't ignore violations just because other violations have been corrected. There was a pause in the recording. Maggie could hear Frank breathing, could hear him trying to gather himself, trying to find words that would make Richard understand that this was not about community standards. This was about power, about control, about one man systematically destroying another for reasons that had nothing to do with fence heights or mailbox colors. When Frank spoke again, his voice was different, smaller, the sound of hope dying. Mr. Thornton, what do you want from me? Just tell me. What will make this stop? Richard's response was immediate, like he had been waiting for this question, like this was the moment he had been maneuvering toward all along. I want you to understand something, Mr. Morrison. This community has standards because I maintain those standards. Before I became president, this neighborhood was sliding. Property values were declining. People were letting things go. I changed that. I brought order. I established expectations. And I enforce them. He paused. Maggie could imagine him sitting in his perfect house across the street, phone to his ear, clipboard probably in front of him, speaking with the calm certainty of someone who genuinely believed he was doing good work. When people challenge my authority, Richard continued, when they push back, when they argue every citation, when they make my job harder than it needs to be, I don't back down. Ever. That's how you maintain standards. Through consistency, through persistence, through making it clear that compliance is not negotiable. I'm not challenging your authority, Frank said desperately. I'm trying to comply. I'm doing everything you ask. Then you need to do it better. Richard's voice was still calm, still reasonable. And you need to accept that as long as you live in this community, you will be held to the same standards as everyone else. No exceptions, no special treatment, no sympathy for financial hardship or personal difficulties. Standards are standards. This is destroying my life, Frank said. His voice broke completely now. I've spent my retirement savings. My wife is terrified every time we check the mail. We can't sleep. We can't enjoy our home. This is supposed to be where we retire, where we relax. And instead, it's constant stress and constant fear and constant expenses we can't afford. Then perhaps this community isn't the right fit for you, Richard said. The words were delivered without malice, without anger, without any emotion at all. Just a simple statement of fact. If you find the requirements too onerous, if compliance is too expensive, if the stress is too much, you always have the option to sell and find a community with lower standards. We'll lose money if we sell now, Frank said. The housing market is down. We'd take a significant loss. That's not my problem, Richard replied. And the flat effect with which he said it, the complete absence of empathy, the utter indifference to the human cost of his actions, that was somehow worse than if he had been angry. That's a consequence of your choices. You chose to challenge citations instead of complying immediately. You chose to hire a lawyer instead of accepting corrections. You chose to make this difficult. Those were your choices. The financial consequences are yours to bear. There was a long silence in the recording. Maggie could hear something that might have been crying. Might have been Frank trying to breathe through the realization that reason would not work, that pleading would not work, that there was no way out except through or away. When Frank spoke again, his voice was barely a whisper. What if I can't afford to leave? Richard's response was immediate and final. Then I suggest you find a way to afford compliance. You have 30 days to address the outstanding violations. After that, I'll file for daily fines under Section 7.3 of the bylaws. $50 per day per violation. That's well within my authority. The board will support it. They always do. Another pause. Then Frank asked the question that broke Maggie's heart, the question of a man who had already given up but could not quite admit it yet. Is there any way to resolve this? Any way to end this that doesn't involve me losing everything? Yes, Richard said. Comply fully. Immediately. Perfectly. Maintain compliance indefinitely. Accept my authority without question. Stop arguing, stop pushing back, stop making trouble. Do that and we'll have no problems. The recording ended there. Just cut off mid-silence. Like Frank had hung up, or like the recording had captured everything that needed to be captured, and there was nothing left to say. Helen closed the laptop. Her face was wet with tears, but her expression was controlled, determined. 2 weeks later, Frank drove to the Morrison Bridge at 4:15 on a Tuesday afternoon, left his car running, left his phone on the passenger seat with a note typed into it. All it said was, "I'm sorry. I tried. I can't do this anymore." She looked at Maggie directly. The police ruled it suicide. Mental health crisis, they said. No note explaining why. No indication of what pushed him over, because Frank didn't leave details. Didn't want to make trouble even in death. Didn't want me to have to face the shame of everyone knowing he'd been broken by an HOA president. But I know, Helen continued. I know what that phone call was. It was Richard giving Frank a choice. Comply or die. He just didn't say the second part out loud. Didn't have to. Because Frank understood. Understood that there was no winning, no escaping. That Richard would keep going until Frank either submitted completely or left. And leaving would destroy us financially. So Frank found a third option. The silence in the room was heavy. Maggie could not speak. could not process the calculated cruelty she had just heard. The systematic destruction of another human being delivered in tones of customer service efficiency. Richard had not screamed, had not threatened violence, had just calmly explained how he was going to make Frank's life unbearable until Frank chose to end it. "This is evidence," Maggie finally managed. "This proves harassment. This proves intent to harm." "I know," Helen said. "That's why I'm giving it to you. Why I'm finally ready to use it. Use it to stop him. Use it to make sure no one else ends up where Frank ended up. Use it to prove that being quiet about abuse doesn't make it go away. It just lets it continue." Maggie felt like she might be sick. The casual cruelty of it, the calculated destruction of another human being delivered in tones of administrative efficiency. Richard had not lost his temper, had not shouted, had just methodically explained how he was going to break Frank Morrison until Frank broke himself. "Why didn't you use this before?" Maggie asked. "This proves harassment. This proves his pattern." Helen's eyes filled with tears. "Because I was ashamed. Because I blamed Frank for not being stronger. Because I couldn't admit that my husband was driven to suicide by an HOA president. It sounded ridiculous, impossible. People would think Frank was mentally ill, that this was just an excuse. And part of me believed that too, that if Frank had just been more reasonable, more willing to compromise, this wouldn't have happened." She wiped her eyes. But listening to that recording again, hearing Richard's voice, understanding the systematic nature of it, Frank wasn't weak. He was targeted by someone who knew exactly how to break people. And I've been carrying that recording like a secret shame for 3 years, when I should have been using it as evidence. "Can I send this to Robert?" Maggie asked. "That's why I brought it." Helen's voice was steady despite the tears. "Use it. Show people who Richard really is, what he's really doing. Don't let him do to you what he did to Frank." After Helen left, Maggie forwarded the recording to Robert with a message. Evidence of pattern. Frank Morrison 2 weeks before his death. She did not know what else to say. The recording spoke for itself. Robert's response came within the hour. "This changes everything. This shows premeditation. This shows intentional infliction of harm. This goes beyond HOA overreach into potential criminal territory. I'm forwarding to Inspector Santos and copying to the city attorney's office. Richard just made a huge mistake." That night, Maggie could not sleep. She lay in bed staring at the ceiling, listening to the house settle, thinking about Frank Morrison's last conversation with Richard, thinking about his voice getting smaller and more defeated with each word, thinking about him driving to that bridge 2 weeks later, thinking about how Richard had probably gone on with his day without a second thought. At 1:47 in the morning, her phone buzzed on the nightstand. Security camera alert, motion detected at side of house. She had set up the cameras after the first confrontation with Richard, after Helen had told her about Frank. A precaution that had felt paranoid at the time. Now it felt prescient. She grabbed the phone, pulled up the camera feed with hands that were already shaking before she even saw what had triggered the alert. The image was grainy, black and white infrared, but clear enough to see what was happening, clear enough to identify who was there. Richard Thornton stood at her utility box, wearing dark clothes that looked almost tactical. Black jacket, black pants, dark shoes. Not his usual polo shirt and khakis. This was someone dressed for not being seen, for sneaking, for doing things that required darkness and secrecy. He looked around furtively, checking over both shoulders, scanning the street for witnesses. The motion was quick, practiced, like he had done this before, like sneaking around in the middle of the night was a skill he had developed. Then he reached into his jacket and pulled something out. A putty knife, the kind contractors used for scraping paint, for removing things that were stuck. Maggie watched, heart pounding so hard she could feel it in her throat, as he positioned the putty knife under the edge of the red tag. The city's official stop work order, the piece of paper that represented governmental authority telling him to cease and desist. He worked the knife carefully, trying to get leverage without tearing the heavy paper. The tag did not come easily. The city used industrial adhesive designed to withstand weather and tampering, but Richard was patient, methodical. He worked one corner, then another, using the knife to slowly separate paper from metal. Every few seconds he would stop, look around again, make sure he was still alone, make sure no one was watching. But Maggie was watching, And the camera was recording. And somewhere in Richard's mind, did he not realize that security cameras existed, that people had them, that this would be documented? Or did he simply not care anymore? Had his need for control become so overwhelming that rational risk assessment had ceased to function? Was this what happened when someone who had operated with impunity for years suddenly faced real consequences? Did they double down, escalate, make decisions that in any sober assessment would be recognized as catastrophically stupid? She watched him work for almost 2 full minutes. The tag was coming off. One corner completely free now. Then a second corner. He was making progress. In another minute, he would have it off completely, would crumple it up, would dispose of it, would pretend the city had never issued it, would go back to operating as if official authority did not apply to him. Maggie should call the police, should call Inspector Santos, should do something official and proper, and by the book. But for a long moment, she just watched. Watched this man who had projected such authority in public, who had spoken at community meetings with the confidence of someone who knew the rules and knew he was following them, reduced to sneaking around in the middle of the night with a putty knife trying to remove evidence of his own violation. There was something almost pathetic about it, almost sad. This was what control looked like when it slipped away. This was what authority looked like when it was exposed as nothing more than the willingness to be louder and more persistent than anyone else. Richard Thornton, HOA president, successful attorney, pillar of the community, caught on camera at 2 in the morning committing a crime that a child could understand was wrong. Then she called Santos, the number he had given her, his personal line for emergencies. He answered on the second ring, voice alert despite the hour. No grogginess, no confusion, just immediate attention. Inspector Santos, this is Margaret Chen. Richard Thornton is at my utility box right now. He's trying to remove the red tag. I'm watching it happen on my security camera. Do not confront him, Santos said immediately. She could hear movement in the background. Rustling, the sound of him getting dressed, getting ready, moving into action. Are you safe inside? Doors locked? Yes, I'm watching from my bedroom. He doesn't know I can see him. Good, stay there. Do not go outside. Do not alert him to your presence. Keep recording if you can. I'm calling police dispatch right now and I'm on my way. I'm 15 minutes out. She heard him making another call in the background. Terse conversation with police dispatch. Possible tampering with city property in progress. Officer requested for immediate response. Then back to her. Mrs. Chen, stay on the line with me. Keep watching. Tell me what he's doing. She narrated what she saw. Richard getting the third corner of the tag loose, working on the fourth, almost having it free. His movements getting more confident, more rushed, like he thought he was going to get away with it. Like he thought that at 2 in the morning on a residential street, he could commit a crime and no one would know. He's almost got it off, she said. Just one corner left attached. Police are 3 minutes out, Santos replied. I'm right behind them. Just keep watching. Document everything. The camera had a recording function. She activated it, made sure every second was being saved, made sure that when this went to court, when this became part of the official record, there would be no question about what Richard Thornton had done. No ambiguity, no room for him to claim misunderstanding or good intentions. 7 minutes later, headlights turned onto her street. Not one vehicle, 2. A police cruiser with lights off but moving fast. Then Santos's city truck right behind it. They pulled up to the curb in front of her house with the kind of coordinated precision that suggested they had done this before, had responded to situations like this together, had learned how to work as a unit. Richard froze in the headlights like a deer. For one perfect moment, he was completely still, caught, the red tag 3/4 peeled off and the putty knife still in his hand. His face in the camera was visible now as the headlights illuminated him. And the expression was not what Maggie expected. Not anger or defiance, just shock, pure, unfiltered shock, like he genuinely had not expected to get caught, like he had convinced himself that rules did not apply to him even when breaking them at 2 in the morning on someone else's property. 2 officers got out of the cruiser, one male, one female, both moving with the practiced calm of professionals who dealt with stupid decisions on a nightly basis. Santos got out of his truck carrying his clipboard and his camera, and an expression that managed to convey both, I told you this would happen, and I'm disappointed you made me be right." They approached Richard with the casual authority of people who dealt with situations like this regularly, not drawing weapons, not shouting, just walking up to a man who was clearly in the wrong and needed to be stopped. "Sir," one of the officers said, "step away from the equipment." Richard set down the putty knife, smoothed his jacket. When he spoke, his voice was calm, controlled. "Officers, I'm the HOA president. I was checking on a safety concern." "At 2 in the morning?" the officer asked. "I received a call about a potential issue." Richard gestured to the box. "This equipment has been flagged as hazardous. I was conducting an inspection." Santos stepped forward. "Mr. Thornton, you were ordered to cease interference with this equipment. That red tag is an official city stop work order. Tampering with it is a violation of Municipal Code Section 12.36. "I'm not tampering, I'm inspecting." Richard's voice never changed, stayed perfectly level. But Maggie could see tension in his shoulders, in the way he held himself too still. "This is HOA property. I have authority." "You have no authority over permitted city utility infrastructure," Santos said. He took photos of the scene, the partially removed tag, the putty knife, Richard standing there in dark clothes at 2 in the morning. "And you were explicitly ordered not to interfere." "This is harassment," Richard said. "Mrs. Chen has filed false complaints. She's weaponizing city resources against me." The officer pulled out a notepad. "Sir, do you own or rent the property you're currently standing on?" Richard hesitated. "No." "Were you invited to be here at 2 a.m.? Another hesitation. "I don't need an invitation to inspect HOA infrastructure." "This isn't HOA infrastructure," Santos said. He held up his clipboard, showed Richard something. "This is private residential infrastructure per city permit 4428. You're on private property without permission, tampering with official city orders. That's criminal trespass and vandalism of government property." Richard's composure finally cracked, just slightly. A tightness around his eyes, a set to his jaw. "You're overreacting. This is a simple misunderstanding." "No, sir," the officer said. "This is you being caught on camera committing a crime. We're going to need you to come with us." They did not arrest him. Not quite. But they escorted him to the police station for questioning, took his statement, issued a citation, warned him that any further contact with Maggie's property would result in arrest. Santos stayed behind after the police left with Richard. He examined the red tag, which was damaged but still partially attached, photographed the putty knife, made notes. "Mrs. Chen," he said when he was done, "this escalates the city's investigation. What he did tonight, attempting to remove official orders, that's serious. Plus, we have that audio recording your lawyer sent over. The pattern is clear. We're moving this to the city attorney for review." "What does that mean?" Maggie asked. "It means this stops being about one utility box and starts being about systematic abuse of authority. It means Richard Thornton is in real trouble." After Santos left, Maggie stood in her driveway as dawn started to lighten the eastern sky. She had not slept, had watched the whole confrontation through her window, had seen Richard reduced from authority figure to caught criminal in the span of minutes. She felt no triumph, just exhaustion, and a kind of sadness that any of this was necessary. That a man could be so desperate for control that he would sneak around at 2 in the morning with a putty knife. That pride could blind someone so completely to their own dissent. The neighborhood started waking up. Lights came on in houses. People emerged for their morning routines. Several stopped their cars, staring at Maggie's house, at the police tape Santos had left around the utility box, at the evidence markers he had placed. The spectacle of official investigation made visible. By 8 a.m., the neighborhood group chat was on fire. Maggie's phone buzzed constantly with notifications. She finally opened it. The messages ranged from supportive to hostile with very little middle ground. Some neighbors expressing concern, asking if she was okay, offering help. Others angry that she had involved police, that she was creating drama, that she was making the neighborhood look bad. One message from Tom Martinez, the veteran who had stood at the community meeting. "This needed to happen. Thank you for not backing down." Another from a neighbor she barely knew. "You're tearing this community apart. Richard has served us well for years. This vendetta needs to stop." She closed the app without responding. There was nothing to say that would change minds already made up. People would believe what they wanted to believe, would align themselves based on their own interests and fears and histories. Emma Rodriguez texted privately, "I saw the police. Are you okay?" Maggie responded, "Fine." Richard was caught tampering with the red tag. The response came immediately. Good. He deserves worse. That afternoon, Sarah arrived unannounced. Maggie heard a car in the driveway, looked out to see her daughter getting out of a rental sedan with a small suitcase. Sarah had flown across the country without warning, had just shown up. "Mom," Sarah said when Maggie opened the door. "I saw the news." Local news had picked up the story. HOA president caught vandalizing city property. "This is insane." They sat in the living room. Sarah looked exhausted, like she had not slept on the flight, like she had been crying. "Mom, I'm scared for you. This man is clearly unstable. What if he does something worse than tampering with a tag?" "He's not violent," Maggie said, though she was not entirely sure that was true. Richard's control had always been administrative, legal, bureaucratic, but cornered animals did unpredictable things. "You don't know that," Sarah said. She grabbed Maggie's hands. "This has gone too far. Drop it. Let the city handle it. Move in with me until this blows over." "I can't just leave." "Why not?" Sarah's voice rose. "What's keeping you here? The house? Dad's office that you can't even bear to clean out? This podcast project that's consuming your life?" "The podcast launches in 3 weeks," Maggie said quietly. "December 15th, your father's birthday. I promised you, I'm finishing it." Sarah pulled her hands back. "You're risking your safety for a promise to a dead man." The words hung between them. Harsh, true, painful. "Yes," Maggie said finally, "I am. Because promises to the dead are the only ones I can still keep. Because your father believed these stories mattered. Because finishing what he started is the only thing that makes his death feel like it had purpose, instead of just being random and cruel." Sarah's expression crumpled. "Mom, I can't lose you too." Maggie reached out, pulled her daughter close. Sarah resisted for a moment, then collapsed into the embrace. They sat like that for a long time, mother and daughter, both grieving, both scared, both trying to figure out how to live in a world that had taken Daniel from them. "I'm not going anywhere," Maggie said into Sarah's hair. "I'm being careful. I have Robert, I have Helen. I have the police involved now. Richard can't just do whatever he wants anymore." "He tried to at 2 a.m., Sarah pointed out. "And he got caught. That's the point. Every time he acts, there are consequences now. He's not operating in darkness anymore." They spent the rest of the day together. Ate lunch, talked about Daniel, about memories, about the podcast. Sarah listened to some of the interviews Maggie had edited, heard her father's voice asking questions, drawing out stories, making space for people to be heard. "He was good at this," Sarah said quietly, "making people feel like they mattered." "He was good at a lot of things," Maggie agreed. "I'm just trying to do justice to his vision." "You're doing more than that," Sarah said. "You're finding your own voice in the process." That evening, there was a knock at the door. Patricia Reeves stood on the porch, looking nervous, looking over her shoulder, looking like she had something to say that scared her. "Can I come in?" she asked. "I need to tell you something about Richard, something that could end all of this, but it will destroy him completely, and I need to know if you want that." Maggie let her in. Sarah stayed in the living room, protective and suspicious. Patricia sat on the edge of the couch, hands clasped so tight her knuckles were white. "I've been doing research," Patricia said. "Property records, court documents, background that Richard thought he'd buried." She pulled out a folder, printed pages, official-looking documents. Richard's wife didn't die while they were married. She left him, filed for divorce, got a restraining order. Maggie's breath caught. A restraining order? Patricia nodded. Allegations of emotional abuse, control, isolation. Everything he does to this neighborhood, he did to her first. She died 6 months after leaving him. Car accident. But she died free. The divorce was almost final. "Why did Richard tell everyone she died while married?" Sarah asked. "Because the truth made him look bad," Patricia said. "Made him look like what he is. Someone whose need for control drove away the person he claimed to love. So he rewrote history, told everyone she died suddenly, played the grieving widower, used sympathy to build authority." She pushed the folder across the coffee table. "If this comes out, he's finished. Not just as HOA president. Socially destroyed. His reputation in every circle he operates in. This is the kind of thing that follows a person forever." "Why are you bringing this to me?" Maggie asked. Because you have a choice, Patricia said. You can use this. End the fight right now. Richard will resign rather than have this exposed. Or you can fight clean. Beat him on the merits. Prove your case without destroying his life. Sarah reached for the folder, but Maggie stopped her. Not yet. Mom, Sarah said, this proves he's been lying. This shows who he really is. It shows his marriage failed, Maggie said slowly, painfully. It shows he lied about it, but does it show he's wrong about the utility box? Does it prove the harassment? Does it change the facts of what happened? It gives you leverage, Patricia said. That's all I'm offering. The choice of how to use it is yours. After Patricia left, Maggie sat with the folder unopened on the coffee table. Sarah paced the living room, frustrated, worried, wanting her mother to take the easy path, the quick victory, the weapon that would end this. You should use it, Sarah said. He's trying to destroy you financially. He sent you a cease and desist for $15,000. Why should you fight fair when he's not? Because someone has to, Maggie said. Because using this makes it about his personal life instead of his abuse of power. Because destroying him doesn't fix the system that enabled him. Because Daniel wouldn't want me to win this way. Dad's not here to have an opinion, Sarah said sharply. No, Maggie agreed. But I am. And I have to live with how I win this. If I win it by exposing his failed marriage, by using his wife's trauma as a weapon, what kind of person does that make me? It makes you someone who fights back, Sarah said. Or it makes me Richard, Maggie replied, just with different targets. They argued into the night, Sarah insisting that any weapon was justified against someone like Richard. Maggie insisting that how you fight matters as much as whether you win. Neither convincing the other. Both exhausted and scared and trying to do right in a situation where right was not clear. Finally, near midnight, Sarah went to bed in the guest room. Maggie sat alone in Daniel's office. The folder was on the desk. Unopened still. The temptation to look was overwhelming, to arm herself with the information, to have the nuclear option ready. But she thought about Frank Morrison, about that recording Helen had played, about Richard methodically destroying a man with regulations and citations and relentless pressure, about how Richard had used every tool available to break people. If she used this folder, used Richard's private pain as a weapon, how was she different? Her phone buzzed. Text from Robert. City attorney has scheduled preliminary hearing. 2 weeks. They're moving fast. The night tampering incident plus the Morrison recording has them taking this seriously. So she had 2 weeks. 2 weeks to let the system work. 2 weeks to see if justice could be achieved without resorting to personal destruction. 2 weeks to prove that fighting clean was not the same as fighting weak. She picked up the folder, held it for a long moment. Then she locked it in the filing cabinet with Daniel's permits and insurance papers, available if needed. But not the first choice, not the easy path. Some victories required more courage than others. Some battles were won by choosing not to use every weapon available. Some strength came from restraint rather than attack. Outside, the utility box sat in darkness, the red tag damaged but still attached. Evidence of Richard's desperation. Proof that when cornered, he became reckless. Maggie opened the podcast editing software. Episode 45 needed work. 3 weeks and 1 day until the launch, until Daniel's birthday, until the promise would be kept or broken. She put on the headphones, let Daniel's voice fill her ears, listened to him talk to an elderly Vietnamese woman about coming to America after the war, about losing everything and rebuilding, about the courage it took to start over in a place where nobody spoke your language and nobody knew your story. The woman's voice was soft but determined. I think courage is not big thing, is many small thing. Every day you choose. Choose to try, choose to speak, choose to not give up. That is courage. Maggie listened, edited, shaped the story, did the work. Outside, Richard's house was dark. Tomorrow he would wake up and plot his next move. Tomorrow the battle would continue. Tomorrow there would be new challenges and new pressure and new reasons to question whether fighting was worth the cost. But tonight, she sat in her husband's chair, finishing his work, keeping her promise, and that was enough. That was courage, not the big dramatic kind, just the small daily kind of choosing not to quit when quitting would be easier, choosing to speak when silence would be safer, choosing to try when failure was possible, choosing to fight clean when dirty weapons were available. That was the courage that mattered. The kind that lasted, the kind that let you sleep at night even when the world was against you, the kind that made you someone you could still recognize in the mirror when the battle was finally over. The municipal services building looked like every government building Maggie had ever seen. Concrete and glass erected sometime in the 70s, when brutalist architecture was considered modern. Beige walls that had faded to something closer to gray. Fluorescent lights that hummed with that particular frequency that made your teeth ache if you listened too long. The kind of architecture designed to convey authority through sheer institutional blandness, through the implicit message that beauty did not matter here. Only procedure, only rules, only the grinding machinery of civic governance. She arrived 20 minutes early because Robert had insisted. Better to wait inside than rush in flustered, he had said. Control what you can control. Those were the only things you could control in a situation like this. Your arrival time, your appearance, your composure. Everything else was in the hands of 3 bureaucrats who dealt with disputes like this every week, and probably did not care who won, as long as the paperwork was correct. Sarah sat beside her in the waiting area outside the hearing room. Orange plastic chairs bolted to the floor, a water fountain that dripped, motivational posters about civic duty that had been hanging so long the paper had yellowed at the edges. Her daughter had refused to leave after the night incident, had canceled work meetings across the country, had rearranged her entire life to be here for this. For moral support, she said. But Maggie suspected it was also to witness, to see her mother do the things Sarah had begged her to do for Daniel. Fight back, refuse to be quiet, stand up even when standing up was terrifying. To see if Maggie would really go through with it or would fold at the last minute the way Sarah feared she would, the way she always had before. Helen was there too, sitting 3 chairs down, dressed in her best suit from 20 years ago that still fit but looked dated in a way that made Maggie's heart hurt. Navy blue with shoulder pads that belonged to a different decade. But she wore it with dignity, with the bearing of someone who had buried a husband and survived and would not be diminished by outdated fashion. She held a folder in her lap, the folder containing Frank's documentation, the evidence that would be entered today. She met Maggie's eyes and nodded once, solidarity without words, understanding without explanation. Emma Rodriguez had come as well. She sat near the door looking like she might bolt at any moment. Her mother was watching the kids. Emma wore her work clothes because she would have to leave right after to make her shift at the restaurant, where she waited tables and took abuse from customers who thought tipping 15% made them generous. But she had taken the morning off, had used vacation time she probably could not afford to lose, had come to bear witness, to represent all the others Richard had targeted who could not be here, who had moved away or given up or just wanted to forget. Robert sat at the table inside the hearing room reviewing notes. They could see him through the interior window. He had a legal pad covered in his careful handwriting, tabs on documents color-coded by topic, a system that looked thorough and professional and reassuring. He looked up when the door opened, caught Maggie's eye, gave her a small nod. Ready. Richard Thornton entered with his attorney Marcus Webb at 8:45, 15 minutes early but not as early as Maggie. Even in this, he was competing. Even in this, he had to demonstrate that he was more prepared, more professional, more in control. Richard wore a suit that probably cost more than Maggie's monthly mortgage payment. Charcoal gray with subtle pinstripes, perfectly tailored to his frame. The kind of suit that announced itself as expensive without being flashy. Understated wealth, professional authority. He looked composed, confident, like a man walking into a situation he knew he would navigate successfully because he had navigated situations like this his entire career. 40 years practicing law teaches you how to present yourself in official proceedings, how to project competence, how to make bureaucrats believe you know what you are talking about. Marcus carried a leather briefcase that matched his shoes. Cordovan leather buffed to a mirror shine. Everything about them projected expensive competence. They were not here to beg. They were here to correct a misunderstanding, to set the record straight, to make clear that Richard Thornton had acted properly and that this entire proceeding was unnecessary. They did not look at Maggie, did not acknowledge her at all, did not even glance in her direction as they moved to their table on the opposite side of the room. just moved with the brisk efficiency of people who had better things to do than deal with frivolous complaints from overwrought widows. The message was clear. She was beneath notice, beneath concern. This hearing was a formality they would navigate easily, and then return to their important lives, while she returned to her grief and her delusions. The waiting room was silent, except for the fluorescent hum and the dripping fountain. Maggie watched the clock on the wall. The second hand stuttered with each tick like it was struggling against some invisible resistance. 8:50, 8:51, 8:52. Time moved differently when you were waiting for something that might change everything, or might change nothing. At 8:57, a clerk emerged from the hearing room. "Margaret Chen party?" she called. Maggie stood. Sarah stood with her. Helen and Emma followed. They filed into the room that would determine whether weeks of fear and stress and fighting had been worth it, or whether Richard would walk away with his authority intact and his vendetta justified. The panel filed in at 9 a.m. exactly, punctual to the second. In that way government officials are when punctuality is one of the few things they can control absolutely. 3 city officials in business casual attire that suggested authority without requiring the expensive suits. The chair was Martha Vega, Director of Utilities Enforcement, late 50s, Hispanic, wearing a blazer over a simple blouse and an expression that suggested she had seen everything the world had to offer and was impressed by nothing. Her hair was pulled back severely. No makeup, no jewelry, except a simple watch. Everything about her said competent professional who would not be swayed by emotion or rhetoric. Beside her sat James Chen, Deputy City Attorney, Asian American, probably mid-30s, wearing glasses and taking notes before anything had even started. His legal pad was already half full. Maggie wondered what he could possibly be writing. Maybe just observations. Maybe just the bureaucratic habit of documentation. Everything must be recorded. Everything must be preserved for potential appeals. And Michael Torres, Code Enforcement Supervisor. Older, maybe 65, white-haired with the kind of weathered face that came from decades of fieldwork, of climbing into attics and crawl spaces, of inspecting foundations and roofs and electrical panels, of looking at what homeowners tried to hide and what contractors did when they thought no one would check their work. He had the bearing of someone who had made 10,000 decisions about code compliance and knew the difference between technical violations and real hazards. They took their seats at the elevated table that put them physically above everyone else. The architecture of authority made literal through furniture placement. The panel above, the parties below, the physical manifestation of power dynamics that would determine who was right and who would pay for being wrong. Martha looked at the room. At Richard's side with its expensive lawyers and confident posture and materials organized in leather portfolios. At Maggie's side with its modest presentation and nervous energy and folders held together with binder clips. The contrast was stark: money versus determination, professional expertise versus righteous anger, the establishment versus the individual. "This is a preliminary hearing regarding complaint number 2024-3847, Martha said. Her voice was flat, professional, devoid of any inflection that might suggest prejudgment. "Unauthorized interference with permitted utility infrastructure at 847 Sycamore Drive. We will hear from both parties. We will review evidence. We will make a determination." Mr. Webb, you represent the respondent, Richard Thornton? "Yes, Your Honor." Marcus stood. "Though this isn't a courtroom and she's not a judge, the honorific was deliberate, an attempt to frame this as formal legal proceedings where his expensive expertise would matter more than facts." "Ms. Vega will suffice," Martha said. "This is an administrative hearing, not a trial. Mr. Kim, you represent the complainant, Margaret Chen?" "Yes, ma'am." Robert stood, respectful but not obsequious. "We'll begin with opening statements. Mr. Webb?" Marcus stood again, smoothed his jacket. When he spoke, his voice carried the practiced authority of someone who had argued in actual courtrooms and was slumming it in this administrative hearing. "This matter involves a fundamental misunderstanding of homeowners association authority and an unfortunate escalation by a grieving widow who has conflated personal loss with institutional overreach." He was framing it from the first sentence, painting Maggie as emotional, irrational, someone whose judgment could not be trusted because she was in grief. It was effective rhetoric, subtle, professional, devastating if allowed to stand unchallenged. Mr. Thornton has served as HOA president for 6 years with distinction, Marcus continued. He has maintained property values, enforced community standards, operated within the scope of his authority as granted by the bylaws every resident agreed to when purchasing property. The utility box in question is located within the community boundaries. Mr. Thornton's action in securing it was consistent with his duty to ensure safety compliance. He paused, let that sink in, made it sound reasonable, like Richard was just doing his job. What we have here is a resident who disagreed with a legitimate administrative action. Rather than work through proper channels, she filed a complaint with city officials. This hearing is the result of that escalation. We will demonstrate that Mr. Thornton acted within his authority, that no violation occurred, and that the city's involvement was unnecessary and improper. He sat down. It was a good opening. Maggie felt her confidence waver, felt the old familiar doubt creeping back. Maybe she had overreacted. Maybe this was all a misunderstanding. Maybe she should have just worked within the HOA system instead of involving the city. Robert's hand touched her arm briefly, steadying, reminding her that this was theater, that Marcus was performing, that facts would matter more than rhetoric. Mr. Kim? Martha gestured. Robert stood. When he spoke, his voice was quieter than Marcus's but clearer. This is about a simple question. Did Richard Thornton have authority to lock Margaret Chen's utility box? The answer is no. The permit is clear. Single residence, private access, no HOA oversight. The city confirmed this. Inspector Santos red-tagged the installation as unauthorized. That's not a misunderstanding, that's a violation. He picked up a document. This is the permit. Approved August 2023. Inspected and passed. No conditions requiring HOA approval. No shared access. No community oversight. Private residential infrastructure. Another document. This is the red tag issued by Inspector Santos. It cites Municipal Code Section 12.36. Unauthorized interference with permitted infrastructure. Mr. Thornton was ordered to cease and desist. Instead, he attempted to remove the tag at 1:47 a.m. on October 27th. That attempt was captured on security camera and resulted in police citation. Robert set down the papers. This isn't about HOA authority. It's about one person interfering with another person's property without legal right. The city is involved because that's exactly what the city should be involved in. Protecting residents from unauthorized interference, regardless of who's doing the interfering. He sat down. Maggie breathed a little easier. Robert had made it simple, clear, not emotional, just factual. Marcus had tried to make this complicated and personal. Robert had stripped it back to basics. We'll hear testimony, Martha said. Mr. Webb, call your first witness. Richard Thornton took the stand. He was sworn in with his hand on a Bible that the city kept for this purpose. When he spoke, his voice was calm, reasonable. The voice Maggie had heard a dozen times at community meetings. The voice of someone who genuinely believed he was in the right. Marcus led him through his background, 6 years as HOA president, 40 years practicing law before retirement, detailed knowledge of community bylaws and governance, a record of increasing property values and maintaining standards. Character witnesses would testify later, but Marcus was establishing credentials now, making Richard seem authoritative, trustworthy, someone who knew what he was doing. Mr. Thornton, why did you install the lock on Mrs. Chen's utility box? Safety concerns, Richard said. We'd received complaints about unsecured electrical equipment. The box was accessible to anyone. Children play in that area. We have a duty to protect residents from potential hazards. Did you have authority to take this action? Yes. The HOA bylaws section 14.2 grants the board authority over community safety matters. External equipment that poses potential risk falls under our jurisdiction. Marcus showed him the bylaws. Richard read the section aloud. It was vague enough to be interpreted broadly. Any external equipment that may pose safety or aesthetic concerns may be subject to board oversight. The word may did a lot of work there. Created ambiguity where there should have been clarity. And the box is external, visible from common areas? Yes, anyone walking by can see it. Children have been observed playing near it. This was new. Maggie had never seen children near her utility box. It was on the side of her house away from the street. But Richard said it with such confidence that it sounded true. Robert's cross-examination was careful, precise. Mr. Thornton, did you obtain a permit before installing the lock? Number HOA actions don't require city permits. Did you notify Mrs. Chen before installing it? Notice isn't required for safety measures. Did you document the safety concerns you mentioned? File any reports? Take photographs of these children you claim were playing near electrical equipment. Richard hesitated, just a fraction of a second, but visible. The documentation would have been handled administratively. By whom? By board staff. Richard's voice was slightly less certain now. The HOA has staff? No, but minutes would have been taken. Robert pulled out board meeting minutes, the ones Patricia had provided. I have minutes from the last 12 months of board meetings. Where in these minutes are the safety concerns documented? Richard leaned forward, squinted at the papers. Those might not be complete minutes. These are certified minutes, signed by the board secretary. Robert's voice was still calm, but there was steel underneath. There's no mention of safety concerns regarding Mrs. Chen's utility box. No discussion of children playing near it. No authorization to install a lock. Nothing. The authorization was given in executive session, Richard said. Were executive session minutes kept? Another hesitation. Some matters are too sensitive to document, Martha interrupted. Mr. Thornton, this panel needs documentation. Executive session or not, major decisions require some record. Do you have anything showing board authorization? Richard looked at Marcus. Marcus looked at his notes. The decision was made collaboratively, Richard finally said. The entire board was aware. Robert pulled out another document. This is a statement from Gerald Shu, former board member, retired attorney. He states that he was not informed of the lock installation until after it occurred, that when he learned of it, he objected, that he has no knowledge of any board authorization. Another document. Statement from Monica Reeves. Same information. No advance notice, no vote, no authorization. Mr. Thornton, Robert said quietly, did you install that lock on your own authority without board approval? The room went very quiet. Richard's jaw tightened. I acted in the best interest of the community. That's not what I asked. Did you have board authorization? Yes or no? I had implied authority based on my role as president. So no, Robert said. No explicit authorization, no vote, no documentation. You decided unilaterally to lock another resident's property. To secure community infrastructure, Richard corrected. But his voice had lost some of its confidence. The panel called a 15-minute recess. Maggie stepped outside with Sarah and Helen. Her hands were shaking from adrenaline. Robert had dismantled Richard's credibility piece by piece, but there was still more to come. When they returned, it was Maggie's turn to testify. She was sworn in, sat in the chair that was too hard and too straight, faced the panel, and Richard and Marcus and all the people watching. Her mouth was dry. Robert's questions were gentle, establishing timeline, the discovery of the lock, her attempts to resolve it, Richard's refusal, the impact on her work, the podcast project, the deadline. He kept it factual, kept emotion out of it, let her tell the story in her own words. Then Marcus stood for cross-examination. He smiled as he approached. It was not a kind smile. It was the smile of a predator who had cornered prey and was about to demonstrate why expensive lawyers were worth their fees. The smile of someone who had cross-examined hundreds of witnesses and knew exactly how to find the vulnerable spots and press until something broke. Mrs. Chen, when did your husband pass away? 8 months ago. She knew where this was going, had prepared for it with Robert, but preparation and experience were different things. And you've been living alone since then? His voice was gentle, almost sympathetic. That made it worse somehow. The false kindness wrapped around the knife. Yes, under considerable stress. The word stress carried weight. Implication, suggestion that she was not stable. I've been grieving, yes. Her voice was steady, but it took effort, took conscious control of muscles that wanted to tremble. Grieving is stressful, difficult. It affects people in different ways. Taking any medication for depression or anxiety? Robert started to stand, but Maggie answered before he could object, briefly. After Daniel died. She saw Robert tense, saw him prepare to intervene, but she continued. I don't want to hide it. I was prescribed medication for situational depression. I took it for 2 months. I'm not taking it now. But you were taking it during the initial incident with the utility box? The initial incident, Maggie noted. Not the lock installation, not Richard's interference. The initial incident, like it was something that happened without cause, without agency, just an incident. I had stopped taking it 3 weeks before, she said. But yes, I was still grieving. I'm still grieving now. That doesn't make me incompetent. Of course not, Marcus said smoothly. His voice dripped with false sympathy. No one is suggesting incompetence, but grief can affect judgment. Make us see patterns that aren't there. Make us interpret neutral actions as hostile. Make us react emotionally rather than rationally. Wouldn't you agree? I would agree that grief is painful, Maggie said, that it changes you, that it makes some things harder, but it doesn't make me delusional. It doesn't make me unable to tell the difference between a legitimate safety concern and harassment. Robert objected, argumentative. Sustained, Martha said. Mr. Webb, move on. Marcus nodded, accepting the ruling but having made his point. The seed was planted. Grieving widow, medication, emotional instability. Even if the panel consciously rejected it, the association lingered. That was how effective cross-examination worked. Not through what you proved, but through what you suggested. Mrs. Chen, you've accused my client of harassment, of targeting you specifically, of waiting for your husband to die before acting. Those are serious allegations. Do you have evidence of this beyond your own perception? Yes, Maggie said. She gestured to the folder Helen held. We have documentation of his pattern, other residents he's targeted, board minutes showing repeated violations against specific individuals, violation notices filed in rapid succession, a recording of him threatening Frank Morrison. Ah, yes, the recording, Marcus said. He picked up a piece of paper, examined it like it was something distasteful. Made without my client's knowledge or consent. Recorded in what state? California, Maggie said. And California is a two-party consent state for recordings, is it not? Meaning that recording someone without their knowledge is potentially illegal? Robert stood. The legality of the recording is not relevant to this proceeding. This is not a criminal trial. The panel can consider evidence obtained in ways that might not be admissible in court. I'll allow it for now, Martha said. But Mr. Webb has a point about weight. Continue. Thank you. Marcus turned back to Maggie. So this crucial piece of evidence was obtained illegally by a dead man who cannot testify to its authenticity, claiming to show a conversation that my client maintains never happened the way it's portrayed. That's hardly credible evidence, is it? It shows his pattern of behavior, Maggie said. Her voice was getting stronger now, anger replacing fear. Shows how he operates, how he speaks to people, how he uses his authority to intimidate and threaten. Or it shows a man doing his job, Marcus countered, enforcing rules that residents agreed to follow, having difficult conversations that are necessary in community governance, which is what HOA presidents are elected to do, to make hard decisions, to enforce unpopular rules, to maintain standards even when it creates conflict. He moved closer. Not threatening exactly, but changing the geometry of the room, making himself more present, occupying space that forced Maggie to crane her neck slightly to maintain eye contact. Mrs. Chen, isn't it possible that you're angry about your husband's death? That you're looking for someone to blame for your loss? That you've latched onto my client as a convenient target for that displaced anger? No, Maggie said. But even as she said it, a small part of her wondered. Was there truth there? Was some part of this about anger at Daniel for dying? At the doctors for missing it? At herself for not fighting harder? Was Richard just the target because he was easier to fight than grief? You've stated that my client waited for your husband to die before acting, Marcus pressed. That he specifically targeted you because you're a widow, because he thought you'd be vulnerable. That sounds less like documented fact and more like paranoid speculation, doesn't it? It's documented, Maggie said. Daniel refused him access 6 months before he died. Richard told him he'd deal with it when the time was right. Helen Morrison heard it, can testify to it. Hearsay, Marcus said. One person claiming to have overheard a conversation between 2 other people, one of whom is now dead and cannot confirm or deny. Not evidence. Speculation. Robert stood. That's for the panel to determine what weight to give testimony. The panel will make that determination, Martha agreed. But I'll allow the question. Mrs. Chen, do you have direct evidence that Mr. Thornton targeted you specifically because of your husband's death? Documentary evidence, recordings, written communications, anything beyond your interpretation of events? This was the moment. The question Maggie had known was coming. The moment Patricia's folder became relevant. The nuclear option sitting in her filing cabinet at home. The proof that Richard was not who he claimed to be. The restraining order from his wife. The divorce filing with its allegations of emotional abuse and control. The pattern that predated the HOA. That showed Richard had been doing this his entire life. To his wife. To neighbors. To anyone who challenged his authority. She could mention it now. Could tell the panel that yes, she had evidence. Documentary evidence. Court records showing that Richard's need for control had destroyed his marriage, that his wife had fled from him, had obtained legal protection from him, had died 6 months into divorce proceedings. It would end the hearing immediately, would destroy Richard's credibility completely, would prove that this was not about HOA governance, but about a man whose pathological need for control manifested in every relationship, every interaction, every moment of his life. Sarah was watching her. Maggie could feel her daughter's eyes, willing her to use it, to take the weapon Patricia had offered and deploy it, to win this fight the way fights were won, by using every advantage, every weakness, every vulnerability. But Maggie thought about Daniel, about his voice on the podcast recordings, about the interview with the Vietnamese woman who had talked about courage being many small things, about choosing every day to try, to speak, to not give up. About choosing who you wanted to be. I have evidence of his pattern, she said finally. The words came slowly, deliberately. Evidence of him targeting vulnerable residents over multiple years. Evidence of him using his position to harass people until they comply or leave. That pattern includes me. Whether he specifically targeted me because I'm a widow, or just because he saw an opportunity after Daniel died, I can't prove his internal motivations. But the pattern exists, it's documented, and it's real. Marcus smiled. So no direct evidence, just speculation and pattern evidence that could be interpreted multiple ways. Thank you, Mrs. Chen. No further questions. Maggie stepped down, sat next to Sarah. Her daughter looked at her with an expression Maggie could not quite read. Confusion, maybe, or disappointment, or something else. You didn't use it, Sarah whispered. The folder, Patricia's evidence about his wife. No, Maggie said. Her voice was barely audible. Why not? It would have ended this. Proven everything. Because winning that way would make me him, Maggie said. Would make this about destroying a person instead of correcting a wrong. Would make it personal instead of procedural. It is personal, Sarah hissed. He tried to destroy you financially. He's trying to paint you as crazy. And if I use his failed marriage against him, if I weaponize his wife's trauma, what does that make me? Maggie turned to look at her daughter. I need to be able to live with how I win this. If I win it. Sarah sat back, crossed her arms, said nothing, but her silence spoke volumes. The panel took the evidence that had been presented, Frank's recording, the board minutes showing the pattern of violations, Gerald's documentation of his objections over the years, Emma's stack of citations, Helen's timeline of Frank's progressive breakdown, Inspector Santos's report on the night tampering incident, photos of the lock, the red tag, Richard caught on camera. It was substantial. It was damning. But it was not the nuclear option. It was not the evidence that would destroy Richard as a human being. Just the evidence that would prove he had exceeded his authority. That would demonstrate a pattern. That would justify intervention. Maggie watched the panel review the materials, passing documents back and forth, making notes, occasionally asking Robert or Marcus to clarify something. The process was slow, methodical, bureaucratic in the way that bureaucracy at its best could be. Not dramatic, not emotional, just careful evaluation of facts against standards. This was what justice looked like in practice. Not courtroom drama, not passionate speeches, not revelatory moments. Just 3 government employees doing their jobs with professional competence, reading documents, checking regulations, making determinations. The panel deliberated for 45 minutes. They excused themselves from the room, went somewhere private where the parties could not hear them discuss, could not watch them weigh evidence and interpret regulations, and decide whose version of events aligned better with documented fact. The waiting was worse than the hearing itself. At least during testimony, there had been something to do. Questions to answer, evidence to present. Now there was just silence and speculation. Maggie sat in the orange plastic chair and tried not to imagine what they were saying, tried not to second-guess every answer she had given, every piece of evidence she had not used. Sarah paced, back and forth across the small waiting area. Her nervous energy filled the space, made everyone else more anxious by proximity. Helen sat perfectly still, hands folded in her lap, eyes closed. Maybe praying, maybe just trying to find calm in the storm of waiting. Emma had to leave for work, apologized, said she would check in later, hugged Maggie quickly and fled like she could not bear to stay for the verdict. Could not handle watching someone else either win or lose against Richard when she had chosen not to fight herself. Robert reviewed his notes, making marks, circling things, probably already thinking about appeals if this went wrong, about next steps, about how to continue fighting if fighting needed to continue. He looked up once, caught Maggie's eye, gave her a reassuring nod that did not feel reassuring at all. Richard and Marcus sat on the other side of the room. They were not pacing, were not visibly anxious. Marcus was on his phone, typing emails probably, billing other clients while he waited for this one's fate to be determined. Richard sat straight-backed and still, looking at nothing. His face was unreadable, composed in that way that suggested either complete confidence or complete denial. At 10:12, the clerk emerged. The panel is ready. They filed back into the hearing room, took their original seats. The panel was already there, already seated, already with the papers arranged in front of them that contained whatever decision they had reached in that private room over the last 45 minutes. Martha's expression was neutral, professional, impossible to read, the perfect bureaucratic face that gave nothing away before the official pronouncement. James Chen was still taking notes. Had he been taking notes during deliberation? Did he take notes about note-taking? Michael Torres looked tired, like he had done this 10,000 times and would do it 10,000 more, and the sameness of it all had worn grooves into his soul. "This panel has reviewed the evidence and testimony," Martha said. Her voice was the same flat professional tone she had maintained throughout. "We find that Richard Thornton did not have explicit authority to install a lock on Margaret Chen's utility box. The permit clearly designates the equipment as private residential infrastructure. HOA bylaws, regardless of how they're interpreted, do not supersede city permits. The installation was unauthorized." Richard's face went pale. The color drained so quickly and completely that for a moment Maggie thought he might faint. Marcus started to stand, hand already moving toward an objection or clarification or something that would soften what was being said. Martha held up her hand, continued. "However, we also find that Mr. Thornton acted in what he believed to be good faith exercise of his HOA authority. While he was incorrect about the extent of that authority, while his interpretation of the bylaws was overly broad, we do not find evidence of malicious intent in the initial installation. We believe he genuinely thought he was acting within his role, though he was wrong." Maggie's heart sank. They were splitting it, finding Richard wrong but excusing him, giving him an out, letting him walk away with his authority damaged but not destroyed, his reputation questioned but not ruined. But Martha was not done. The attempted removal of the city stop work order at 1:47 a.m. on October 27th is a separate matter entirely. She looked directly at Richard. Her neutral expression shifted slightly, not to anger, to disappointment, the look an adult gives a child who should know better. That action was not good faith. That action was knowing interference with official orders. That action demonstrated either a fundamental misunderstanding of city authority or a deliberate decision to ignore it. Neither is acceptable. She consulted her notes. "Mr. Thornton, you are hereby fined $2,500 for tampering with city property. That fine is personal to you, not to the HOA. You will pay it within 30 days or face additional penalties, including possible criminal charges. Additionally, the Pinehurst Estates HOA is placed under administrative oversight for a period of 6 months. During that time, any actions regarding resident property, utility access, or infrastructure modifications must be submitted to this office for approval before implementation. Any violations of this oversight will result in escalated enforcement." She looked at Richard again, held his gaze. "Mr. Thornton, you are removed from any authority over utility infrastructure. You may continue as HOA president if the board chooses to retain you. That is their decision, not ours. But you have no power over systems governed by city permits. You cannot inspect them. You cannot restrict access to them. You cannot modify them. You cannot touch them. Are we absolutely clear? Yes, Richard said. His voice was small, barely audible, the voice of someone whose certainty had been shattered and who was trying to process what that meant. The lock will be removed today by city contractors at Mr. Thornton's expense, Martha continued. Mrs. Chen's utilities will be fully restored within 24 hours. Mr. Thornton will pay all costs associated with removal, restoration, and inspection. This matter is closed. She picked up a gavel. Maggie had not noticed it before, had not realized this was the kind of proceeding that ended with a gavel. Martha brought it down once. The sound was final, absolute, the kind of sound that meant no more discussion, no more argument, decision made, case closed. It was over. Outside in the parking lot, Sarah hugged Maggie so tightly it hurt. Helen cried the kind of crying that was not sadness, but release. The tears of someone who had been holding something in for so long that letting it out felt like breathing for the first time in years. Robert shook Maggie's hand and said, "You did well," quietly, like he had never doubted the outcome, even though Maggie had doubted it every moment. But Maggie felt hollow. Yes, she had won. The lock would come off. The internet would be restored. Richard had been fined and restricted and placed under oversight. But it felt incomplete somehow, like justice had been achieved in letter but not in spirit. Like the system had worked well enough to prevent further harm, but not well enough to fully address the harm already done. The panel had called Richard's initial action good faith, had excused it even while prohibiting it, had said he was wrong but not that he should have known better, had split the difference in a way that probably satisfied no one. Not Richard, who had lost authority and money, not Maggie, who had won but without vindication, not the system which had reached a compromise that felt more administrative than just. Richard emerged from the building with Marcus 20 minutes later. They stood on the steps talking in low, urgent tones. Marcus was gesturing, making points, probably already thinking about appeals or compliance strategies or how to minimize the damage. Richard just stood there, nodding occasionally, not arguing, not fighting, just accepting. Then Richard looked up, saw Maggie watching from across the parking lot. Their eyes met, held. For a moment, neither moved. Then Richard said something to Marcus. Marcus tried to stop him, hand on Richard's arm, but Richard shook him off gently, walked across the parking lot toward Maggie. Sarah tensed, stepped slightly in front of her mother, protective, ready to intervene if this turned confrontational. But Robert put a hand on Sarah's shoulder, held her back. Let this play out. Richard stopped a respectful distance away, 5 feet, close enough to talk, far enough to not be threatening. He looked different somehow, smaller. The confidence stripped away, leaving something else underneath. Not anger, not defiance, just exhaustion. The bone-deep weariness of someone who had finally been stopped after running for so long that stopping felt like collapse. "Mrs. Chen," he said. His voice was quiet, rough like he had been crying, though his eyes were dry. "I owe you an apology." Maggie did not respond, just waited. Let him fill the silence. "I convinced myself I was protecting the community," Richard continued. The words came slowly, like he was testing each one before speaking it. That maintaining control was the same as maintaining standards, that the rules existed to protect people and I was the one enforcing them when no one else would. I told myself that the people who pushed back, who complained, who made trouble, they were the problem, not me. He paused, looked at his hands. I was wrong. About the lock, about my authority, about what protection means, about a lot of things. Helen had approached quietly, stood beside Maggie. Richard saw her. His face did something complicated. Shame and recognition and something that might have been grief. "Mrs. Morrison," he said. His voice broke slightly. "I'm sorry about Frank. I didn't understand what I was doing to him. Didn't see it as harassment. Saw it as enforcement, as maintaining standards, as doing my job. But I was wrong. And I have to live with that. Have to live with knowing that my need to be right, to maintain control, to prove my authority, it cost a man his life." Helen's face was wet with tears, but her voice was steady. "Yes," she said, "you do have to live with that. And maybe that's punishment enough, Or maybe it's not enough. I don't know anymore. But you need to know that Frank was a good man, a kind man, and you broke him. Not intentionally, maybe, but you broke him. And he's dead because he couldn't see any other way out. Richard nodded, accepting, not defending. I know, and I'm sorry. It's not enough. Sorry will never be enough, but it's all I have. He turned back to Maggie. You could have destroyed me completely today. I know you have evidence about my marriage, about Susan leaving, about the restraining order. Patricia told me she gave it to you. You chose not to use it. Why? Because destroying you doesn't fix anything, Maggie said. The words came easier than she expected. Doesn't help the next person you would have targeted. Doesn't change the system that let you operate unchecked for 6 years. Doesn't bring back Frank Morrison or give those years back to his widow. I wanted you stopped, not ruined. There's a difference. Richard was quiet for a long moment. His eyes were wet now. Actually wet. Not crying exactly, but not dry either. That mercy, I don't deserve it. Don't know that I understand it. But thank you. Don't thank me, Maggie said. Just learn from it. Get help. Real help. For whatever it is that makes you need control so badly that you'll destroy people to maintain it. Because this, she gestured between them, this should never have been necessary. A utility box should never have turned into this. No, Richard agreed, it shouldn't have. He walked away, got into his car. A Mercedes, silver, immaculately maintained. The car of someone who projected success and control and authority. He sat in it for a moment before starting the engine. Just sat there, looking at nothing, processing everything. Then he drove away, slowly, carefully, like someone who had forgotten how driving worked and had to relearn it, like someone whose entire framework for understanding the world had been dismantled and who needed to figure out how to rebuild it into something less destructive. The city contractors came that afternoon, removed the lock, restored her internet. The whole process took 15 minutes. 15 minutes to undo what had consumed weeks of her life. The utility box sat there looking ordinary, uninteresting, just a gray metal box on the side of a house. That evening, Maggie sat in Daniel's office. The podcast editing software was open. Episode 44 was complete. 45 was nearly done. 2 more to finish. 2 weeks until the launch. Until December 15th. Until Daniel's birthday. She clicked through the files, listened to snippets of interviews, his voice asking questions, making space, giving people room to be heard. This was his legacy. Not the fight with Richard. Not the victory at the hearing. These stories, these voices. Her phone buzzed. Email from the Cultural Center. Just checking in. Launch still on track for December 15th? We're getting excited. She typed back, yes, on track. All episodes will be ready. Another email from Sarah. Subject line, I'm proud of you, Mom. She opened it. Inside was just one line. You're braver than I ever gave you credit for. Dad would be proud too. Maggie sat back in the chair. Let herself feel the weight of the day. The victory that did not feel like victory. The mercy extended to someone who had not earned it. The choice to fight clean when dirty weapons were available. She thought about Frank Morrison. About the recording of his last conversation with Richard. About how he had begged for mercy and received none. About how she had given Richard what Frank had been denied. Not because Richard deserved it, but because mercy was not about deserving. It was about choosing who you wanted to be. She opened the editing software, put on the headphones, let Daniel's voice fill her ears. An interview with an elderly man from El Salvador, talking about coming north with nothing, building a life, losing everything twice and rebuilding twice. The resilience of someone who understood that survival was not about never falling down. It was about getting up again. Tomorrow there would be more work, more podcast editing. The neighborhood would still be divided. Richard would still be president, though diminished. The internet would be restored, but the damage to community trust would take longer to heal. But tonight, she sat in her husband's chair, did his work, kept her promise, and somewhere in the act of finishing what he had started, she found something that felt like peace. Not the peace of resolution, not the peace of everything being fixed, just the peace of knowing she had fought as hard as she could, as clean as she could, and had come out the other side still recognizable to herself. That was enough. That was victory. Not the kind you celebrate, just the kind you survive. And survival, she was learning, was its own kind of courage. Outside, the utility box sat unlocked under the streetlight. Ordinary, boring, free, just the way it was supposed to be. Some battles were won not through destruction, but through restoration. Not through revenge, but through simply reclaiming what was always rightfully yours. And that, Daniel would have said, was the kind of victory that lasted. The city contractors came that afternoon. 2 men in work uniforms that had seen better days, fabric worn thin at the knees and elbows from years of crawling into tight spaces and kneeling on concrete. They arrived in a white van with equipment that looked older than Maggie, but functioned with the reliability that came from simple mechanical design that predated planned obsolescence. No computers, no digital interfaces, just tools that did one thing well and had been doing that one thing for decades. They knew their job, had probably done it 1,000 times in 1,000 neighborhoods, removed 1,000 locks installed by people who thought rules did not apply to them, or who had convinced themselves that their interpretation of authority superseded written law. They approached the utility box with professional detachment, not judgment, not curiosity, just the matter-of-fact efficiency of workers who had a job to do and would do it properly regardless of the story behind why it needed doing. The whole process took 15 minutes from start to finish, but Maggie watched every second, could not make herself go inside even though Sarah suggested it might be easier not to watch. No, Maggie had said, I need to see it. Need to witness the undoing, the restoration, the return to normal. They photographed the lock from multiple angles first, documented its position with the care of people who understood that evidence mattered, that somewhere in an office downtown, someone would need to verify that this work had been completed according to specification, that the city's order had been followed, that the violation had been remedied. Each photo was cataloged, time-stamped, made part of the permanent record. Then they measured the installation points, the holes drilled into the metal housing, the stress marks where the lock had been forced into place. One of them made notes on a clipboard. Metal fatigue noted. Recommend inspection for structural integrity. Recommend replacement of latch mechanism. The bureaucratic language of people documenting damage for liability purposes, for insurance claims, for the paper trail that would follow this incident through the system. Then came the moment Maggie had been waiting for without fully realizing she was waiting for it. One of the contractors produced bolt cutters, industrial grade, the kind designed specifically to defeat security measures, the kind that said no lock, no matter how expensive or well made, could stand against the proper tool properly applied. He positioned the jaws around the shackle, looked at Maggie. You might want to step back, ma'am. Sometimes there's recoil. She stepped back, watched him brace himself, watched him apply pressure, with the kind of controlled force that came from muscle memory and professional competence. The metal resisted, held, then gave. The sound was final, definitive, a sharp crack like a rifle shot, metal parting under pressure designed specifically to defeat it. The shackle severed clean through. The lock fell away, and the contractor caught it before it hit the ground with reflexes that suggested he had done this exact thing many times before. He held the defeated lock up to the light, examined it. Good quality, he said to his partner. Expensive. Somebody spent money on this. Shame to waste it on something stupid. His partner grunted agreement, bagged the lock. Evidence for the file that would follow Richard Thornton for as long as bureaucratic records existed. Proof that this had happened, that intervention had been required, that the system had functioned to correct abuse. They tested the latch next, opened and closed it multiple times, checked for binding, for damage, for any indication that the lock installation had compromised the mechanism. Found minor issues. The latch was slightly bent. The spring tension was off. The alignment was no longer perfect. Fixable, the first contractor said. But it'll need work. That's additional cost. You'll want to submit that to the city for reimbursement against the fine. Maggie nodded, not really processing, just watching them work, watching the systematic undoing of what Richard had done, the careful restoration of function, The professional competence of people who understood that their job was not just removing a lock, but restoring access, restoring rights, restoring the proper order of things. They inspected the interior of the box next, opened the panel, checked connections, looked for any damage the lock installation might have caused. Water intrusion, corrosion, loose wiring. Found none. Everything internal was as it should have been, as it had always been before Richard had decided it needed securing. The actual equipment had never been at risk. The safety concerns had never been real. This had always been about control masquerading as protection. One contractor photographed the interior while the other made notes. "All systems functional," he said. "No damage to infrastructure. Access restored to specification." He checked boxes on a form, signed it, had Maggie sign as witness to the work completed, gave her copies. Yellow for your records, white goes to the city, pink goes to the enforcement file. Then he explained what would happen next. The internet service should restore within an hour once the equipment reconnected to the network. Might take a full reset of your router to force the handshake. If you have any issues after 2 hours, call this number. He handed her a card. 24-hour technical support. They'll know about this work order. They packed up their tools, loaded the van, drove away without ceremony. Just two men finishing a job and moving on to the next one. For them, this was Tuesday. For Maggie, it was the end of weeks of fighting. The physical manifestation of victory. The tangible proof that standing up had mattered. She stood in her driveway after they left. Just stood there looking at the utility box. It sat there looking ordinary, uninteresting, boring in the way that infrastructure should be boring. No lock, no drama, no symbolic weight. Just a gray metal box on the side of a house doing the job it had been designed to do, providing access to the systems that made modern life possible. Internet, power monitoring, cable management, the invisible essential services that nobody thought about until they stopped working. Except this box was not ordinary anymore. Not to Maggie. It had become the line in the sand, the place where silence had ended and voice had begun. The physical location where she had been forced to choose between accepting what someone with authority told her was true and investigating whether that authority was legitimate, where accommodation had transformed into resistance, where the pattern of a lifetime had finally broken because the cost of maintaining it had become higher than the cost of change. Sarah came out to stand beside her, looked at the box, looked at her mother. "You okay?" she asked. "I think so," Maggie said. "It's strange. I spent weeks fighting to get that lock off. Now it's off and I feel empty instead of victorious." "Because the fight was never really about the lock," Sarah said. "It was about everything else. The lock was just where you drew the line." Maggie nodded. That was exactly right. The lock had been the catalyst, the trigger, the one thing that was concrete enough and wrong enough and documentable enough to fight. But the real battle had been about voice, about agency, about the right to say no and have that no respected, about documentation and process and the belief that systems could work if you forced them to work, by refusing to let abuse happen quietly. 15 minutes to undo what had consumed weeks of her life. But those weeks had changed things that could not be undone by bolt cutters and paperwork, had changed her, had changed the community, had changed the small corner of the world she inhabited. Some changes were permanent even when the physical evidence of conflict was removed. Maggie stood in her driveway watching them drive away. Sarah stood beside her. They had not talked much since the hearing, since Maggie had chosen not to use Patricia's evidence, since Sarah had watched her mother extend mercy to someone who probably did not deserve it. The silence between them was not hostile, just complicated, thoughtful. The silence of two people processing the same event from different perspectives. "You really think that was the right choice?" Sarah asked finally. "Not using the restraining order evidence?" Maggie considered this question, gave it the weight it deserved. "I think it was the only choice I could live with. Whether it was right, I don't know. Maybe there's no right choice, just different kinds of wrong with different consequences." "He would have destroyed you if the positions were reversed," Sarah said. "Probably." Maggie turned to look at her daughter. "But I'm not him. That's the point. If I become him to beat him, what have I won?" Sarah was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "Dad would have been proud of you." The words hit harder than Maggie expected. She felt tears prick her eyes. Your father would have wanted me to be kind, even to people who aren't kind to me, especially to them. They stood together as the afternoon light slanted across the yard. The same yard where Daniel had mowed the lawn every Saturday, where he had planted the rose bushes that were struggling now without his attention, where he had stood 6 months before he died and told Richard Thornton no. The yard held memories in every corner, some painful, some beautiful, all permanent in the way that loss makes certain moments permanent. Inside, Maggie's laptop chimed. Network connection restored. The internet was back. After weeks of mobile hotspots and library trips and workarounds, the simple, mundane miracle of broadband connectivity returned. She pulled up the podcast project, began uploading the completed episodes to the cloud storage, watched the progress bars fill. Episode 44, episode 45. The files that had been trapped on her hard drive finally making their way to the servers where the cultural center could access them. 2 more episodes to finish. 2 weeks until the launch. Until December 15th. Until Daniel's birthday. Until the promise would be kept or broken. She opened episode 46. The interview was with an elderly Chinese woman who had come to San Francisco in the 1960s, had worked in garment factories for 30 years, had raised 3 children who became doctors and teachers and engineers. The story was familiar in its broad strokes. The details were what mattered. The specific texture of one life, one journey, one voice that deserved to be heard. Maggie put on the headphones. Let Daniel's voice fill her ears. Listen to him ask questions with that particular quality of attention that made people feel seen, feel valued, feel like their story mattered as much as anyone else's. She edited, trimmed pauses, adjusted levels, shaped the raw audio into something that honored both the subject and the listener. Sarah brought her tea at some point, set it down without speaking, let her mother work. There was an understanding between them now that had not existed before. A recognition that some work was sacred, that finishing what Daniel had started mattered not because it would bring him back, but because it proved that his belief in the project had been justified, that the stories were worth telling, that the voices deserved amplification. Hours passed, the sun set, the neighborhood went quiet. Maggie worked through the evening with the focused intensity that came from having a deadline and the tools to meet it. By 11 p.m., she had completed the rough edit of episode 46, saved it, backed it up, made notes about what still needed refinement. 1 more episode to go. The next morning brought a knock on the door. Robert stood on the porch holding a folder and wearing an expression that was equal parts professional and personal. "May I come in?" he asked. They sat in the living room. He opened the folder. Inside were documents, legal papers. "Mrs. Chen," he said, using the formal address, even though they were past that now. "The city has closed the case. Richard paid his fine. The HOA has submitted to oversight. Everything is officially resolved." Maggie took the papers, read through them. Official language confirming what she already knew. Case closed. Violation confirmed. Penalties imposed. System functioning as designed. She set them aside. "Thank you, Robert, for everything." "You did the hard part," he said. "I just handled the paperwork." He paused, seemed to be considering something, then continued. "There's something else. Not legal, personal. I wanted to ask if you'd have dinner with me. Not as your lawyer, just as Robert." Maggie felt something flutter in her chest. Surprise, maybe, or possibility, or the unfamiliar sensation of someone seeing her as something other than a grieving widow or a client with a problem. "I don't know if I'm ready for that," she said honestly. "I'm not asking you to be ready," Robert replied. "Just asking if you'd have dinner. As friends. No pressure, no expectations. Just 2 people who've been through something difficult together and might enjoy a meal that isn't about legal strategy." She thought about Daniel, about what he would want for her, about whether it was too soon or whether there was even such a thing as too soon, when grief had no timeline and healing happened in its own way at its own pace. "Okay," she said finally. "Dinner. As friends." Robert smiled. "Good." He stood to leave, then paused at the door. "Margaret, you should know something. What you did at that hearing, choosing not to use evidence that would have destroyed Richard, that took more courage than using it would have. A lot of people would have taken the easy win. You took the hard right. That says something about who you are. After he left, Maggie sat with those words. The hard right versus the easy win. She had never thought of it in those terms. Had just made the choice that felt aligned with who she wanted to be. But maybe that was what courage was. Not the absence of fear, but the presence of values that mattered more than fear. The HOA held new elections the following week. Richard did not run, did not even attend the meeting where nominations were held. Patricia was elected president. Tom Martinez and Gerald Shue joined the board. The first order of business was a formal apology to every resident Richard had cited excessively. Emma Rodriguez received a letter acknowledging that the violations against her had been retaliatory and unjustified. The fines were refunded, the citations expunged from the record. The second order was the creation of a Residents' Bill of Rights, clear language establishing what the HOA could and could not do. What required votes? What required notice? What was simply beyond their authority, regardless of what the bylaws might say. Helen drafted it with Gerald's legal expertise. It was comprehensive. It was clear. It was the kind of document that should have existed from the beginning but had not, because no one had questioned the system until the system became abusive. The third order was the establishment of a community oversight committee. Residents could appeal HOA decisions, could request review of citations, could challenge actions they believed exceeded authority. It was not perfect. No system was perfect. But it was better. It was accountability built into structure, rather than relying on the goodwill of whoever held power. Maggie attended the meeting where these changes were announced. Watched the community that had been fractured begin to knit itself back together. Not perfectly, not completely. Some people still believed Richard had been treated unfairly. Some people still thought Maggie had overreacted. But most people seemed relieved that clear boundaries now existed, that the possibility of another Richard using ambiguity as a weapon had been reduced, if not eliminated. After the meeting, people approached her, some to thank her, some to apologize for not supporting her earlier, some just to acknowledge what she had been through. Emma hugged her and said, "You gave me my home back." Helen squeezed her hand and said Frank would be grateful if he could be. Tom Martinez shook her hand with the firm grip of a man who respected what she had done. "You stood up when no one else would," he said. "That matters. That changes things." Patricia pulled her aside, handed her an envelope. "What's this?" Maggie asked. "Open it later," Patricia said. "Just know that what you did, the choice you made not to use that evidence about Richard's wife, it taught me something. About the difference between winning and being right. About mercy. I won't forget it." At home that night, Maggie opened the envelope. Inside was a check, $5,000, a note in Patricia's handwriting, for the podcast project, for Daniel's legacy, for proving that doing the right thing still matters. Maggie stared at the check, $5,000, enough to cover the costs of the launch event, to pay for professional hosting, to fund promotion, to ensure the podcast reached the audience it deserved. She thought about returning it, about not accepting charity, about maintaining independence. Then she thought about what Daniel would say. He would say that gifts given in good faith should be accepted in good faith, that letting people help was not weakness but community, that sometimes the right thing was just saying thank you and using the gift well. She deposited the check, used it to upgrade the podcast hosting plan, to hire a student from the local college to help with social media promotion, to create materials for the launch event, to honor Daniel's work with the professionalism it deserved. December came, the days grew shorter, the air turned cold, the neighborhood put up Christmas decorations, lights strung on houses, wreaths on doors, the same rituals that happened every year. Life continuing in its cyclical way, regardless of individual struggles. Maggie put up a small tree, the first since Daniel died. Sarah helped. They strung lights that had been in storage, hung ornaments that carried memories, each one a small acknowledgement that life insisted on moving forward even when moving forward felt like betrayal. The final episode, number 47, the last interview Daniel had recorded before his death. Maggie had been avoiding it, saving it for last, knowing that editing it would mean facing his voice one final time in this context. After this, There would be no more raw interviews, no more unedited audio where his presence felt immediate and alive. Just the finished product, the polished episodes, the work complete. She opened the file, put on the headphones, pressed play. His voice filled her ears. "Thank you so much for sharing your story with me today." The subject was a Vietnamese man, elderly, soft-spoken. He talked about coming to America after the fall of Saigon, about losing everything, about starting over with nothing but determination and the belief that tomorrow could be better than today. He talked about working 3 jobs, about sending his children to college, about the pride of seeing them succeed in ways he never could. Daniel's questions were gentle, encouraging, making space. The man's voice grew stronger as he talked, more confident, like the act of being heard was itself healing, like having someone care about his story gave the story weight it had not had before. Maggie listened, edited, cried. The tears came without warning, not the sharp grief of the first months, but something softer, more bittersweet. The recognition that Daniel was gone, but what he had built remained. That his voice on these recordings was both presence and absence, both comfort and loss. She finished the edit at 2 in the morning, saved the file, backed it up, uploaded it to the cloud. 47 episodes complete, 23 hours of content, 43 immigrant stories told with dignity and care, Daniel's legacy preserved, the promise kept. She sat back in his chair, looked at his photo on the desk. "We did it," she said to the image. "Together. You asked the questions. I finished the work. We kept the promise." The launch event was scheduled for December 15th at the Cultural Center, Daniel's birthday. The date had been chosen months ago, when finishing the podcast seemed impossible, when Maggie had still been drowning in grief and doubt, and the overwhelming weight of a promise she did not know how to keep. Now the date had arrived, and the impossible had become actual. 200 invitations sent to people from the interviews, their families, community members, elected officials, local media. The response had been overwhelming. RSVPs kept coming. They had to order more chairs, had to expand the reception, had to plan for a crowd that exceeded every expectation. Maggie woke that morning with anxiety twisting her stomach into knots. This was it. The moment everything had been building toward, the completion of the project, the fulfillment of the promise, the public acknowledgement of work done in private grief and determination. She lay in bed for a long moment, unable to move, thinking about Daniel, about whether he would approve of what she had done, whether the editing was good enough, whether the choices she made honored his vision or violated it, whether finishing his work was tribute or presumption. Sarah arrived early to help, let herself in with the key Maggie had given her weeks ago, found her mother still in bed at 8 a.m. staring at the ceiling. "Mom," she said gently, "you need to get up. We need to leave in 2 hours." "I don't know if I can do this," Maggie said. Her voice was small. "What if it's not good enough? What if I ruined it? What if Daniel would hate what I made from his work?" Sarah sat on the edge of the bed, took her mother's hand. "Dad would be proud of you. Not because the podcast is perfect, but because you finished it, because you kept going when you wanted to quit, because you honored his vision even when it was hard. That's what would matter to him." Maggie sat up slowly. Let Sarah help her get dressed, the navy dress they had picked out together, simple but dignified, professional without being formal. Sarah did her mother's hair, applied subtle makeup, transformed the grieving widow into someone who looked ready to face a crowd. The transformation was superficial, but somehow it helped. Looking the part made being the part feel possible. They drove to the cultural center in silence. Not the uncomfortable silence of earlier weeks, but the companionable quiet of 2 people who had been through something difficult together and had emerged closer for it. When they arrived, the parking lot was already filling. People gathering early, excited, anticipating. The subjects of the interviews were there too. Elderly men and women dressed in their best, looking nervous and proud simultaneously, looking like people about to be honored who were not entirely comfortable with being honored, but were going to accept it with grace. Inside, the cultural center had been transformed. Someone had hung banners with quotes from the interviews. Someone had created photo displays of the subjects. Someone had arranged flowers. Someone had made this space beautiful in a way that honored both the work and the people whose stories made the work possible. Maggie did not know who had done all this. Later, she would learn it was a collaborative effort. Patricia organizing, Helen arranging flowers, Emma helping with photos, Tom providing muscle for heavy lifting. The community that had formed in crisis now contributing to celebration. The director of the Cultural Center, Jennifer Kim, approached with a warmth that felt genuine. She was late 40s, Korean American, wearing a formal hanbok that suggested this event mattered enough to dress for it traditionally. "Margaret," she said, "are you ready?" "No," Maggie said honestly, "but I'm here anyway." "That's courage," Jennifer said, "showing up when you're not ready." She gestured to the growing crowd. "They're here for you, for Daniel, for the stories. You've given them something precious, a record of lives that might have been forgotten, voices that might have been lost. You should be proud." The room continued to fill, 200 chairs set up in neat rows. Not enough, people standing along the walls, sitting on the floor near the front. The fire marshal would probably object, but no one seemed to care. The subjects of the interviews were seated in the front rows, their families around them, children and grandchildren who would hear their parents' and grandparents' stories told properly for the first time, preserved in a way that private family storytelling could never quite achieve. Given weight and validation through the act of public presentation, Maggie scanned the crowd, saw familiar faces, Helen in the third row, eyes already wet, Emma with her mother and children, looking proud, Patricia sitting with the new HOA board members, Tom Martinez, Gerald Shue, the people who had stood with her when standing was difficult. Robert was there too, fourth row. He caught her eye, smiled encouragement, mouthed, "You've got this." At 2 p.m. exactly, the event began. Jennifer gave opening remarks from the podium, talked about the importance of immigrant stories in a nation built by immigrants, about how history was made not just of great events, but of individual lives, about how each person's journey mattered, about how Daniel Miller had understood this, had dedicated his final year to preserving voices that might otherwise have been forgotten, had died before finishing, but had left clear enough vision that his wife could complete the work. Then she invited Maggie to speak. Maggie walked to the podium on legs that felt unsteady, gripped the edges for support, looked at the crowd, at the 200-plus faces watching, at the subjects of the interviews in the front row, at the recording equipment that would capture this moment, at all the evidence that this mattered, that people cared, that the work had been worth doing. "My husband Daniel started this project because he believed stories mattered," she began. Her voice shook but held, carried to the back of the room through the microphone that Jennifer had set up, and tested 3 times to make sure it would not fail at the crucial moment. Not the famous stories, not the ones that make headlines or get written into textbooks. The ordinary ones, the ones about people who came here with nothing and built everything, who faced obstacles and kept going, who raised families and built businesses and contributed to communities in ways that never made news but made all the difference. She paused, breathed, continued. "When Daniel died, I didn't think I could finish this. I'm not a podcaster. I'm not a journalist. I'm not trained in audio production or interview techniques or any of the skills this required. I'm just someone who loved a man who believed in something and made a promise to see it through." Her eyes found the front row, found the Vietnamese man from episode 47, the Chinese woman from episode 46, the Mexican grandmother from episode 32, the Korean couple from episode 19, all of them. 43 people who had trusted Daniel with their stories, who had opened their lives to him, who deserved to know that trust had been honored. "Your stories taught me something," she said, "about courage, about resilience, about the difference between giving up and keeping going, even when keeping going is the hardest thing you can imagine. You came to a country that didn't always welcome you, that made you prove yourself over and over, that questioned your belonging, that made you work twice as hard for half the recognition. You worked jobs that didn't always respect you, jobs that were below your education level, below your dignity, below what you deserved. You built lives that weren't always easy, that required sacrifice and determination and a kind of stubborn hope that tomorrow could be better than today, even when today was crushing. She could see people in the audience nodding, recognizing themselves, recognizing their parents or grandparents, recognizing the universal struggle wrapped in specific details. "And you did it anyway?" Maggie continued. Her voice was getting stronger now, the fear giving way to something else, conviction maybe, or just the momentum of speaking truth. Because that's what survival looks like. That's what courage looks like. Not the loud, dramatic kind that makes movies, the quiet, persistent kind that shows up every day and does the work and refuses to quit even when quitting would be easier. That's the courage this podcast documents. That's the courage Daniel wanted to honor. That's the courage I've tried to preserve in his absence. The room was silent, completely silent. The kind of silence that felt like held breath, like collective attention so complete that even breathing seemed intrusive. She continued. This podcast launches today because of all of you, because you trusted Daniel with your stories, because you sat with him for hours and answered questions that were sometimes difficult, because you let him into your lives and your memories and your pain, because you trusted me to finish what he started even though I was a stranger who had only met most of you once or not at all. Thank you for that trust. I hope we've honored it. She stepped down. The applause was immediate, sustained, not polite acknowledgement, but genuine appreciation. The kind of applause that came from people who felt seen, who felt valued, who felt like their stories had been treated with the dignity they deserved. Some people stood, then more, then everyone. A standing ovation that went on for 3 full minutes while Maggie stood beside the podium, not knowing what to do with her hands or her face, or the tears that were streaming down her cheeks without her permission. Sarah, the director, returned to the podium, gestured for quiet. The noise subsided slowly. "Now," she said, "we will play selections from the podcast. Not all 47 episodes, we'd be here for days, but enough to give you a sense of the whole, enough to hear these voices, enough to understand why this work matters." The lights dimmed. The screen lit up with the podcast logo that Sarah had designed. Simple text over a background of photographs. Voices of Home, an immigration archive, created by Daniel Miller, completed by Margaret Chen. The audio began. Maggie watched the front row, watched the subjects listen to their own voices, some crying, some smiling, some sitting in that quiet contemplation that came from hearing your life story told back to you, and recognizing it as true, as important, as worth preserving. After the official presentation, people approached the subjects, asked questions, thanked them. The Vietnamese man from episode 47 was surrounded by young people wanting to know more. The Chinese woman from episode 46 was being interviewed by a local reporter. Each subject became the center of their own small circle, their own moment of recognition. Robert appeared at Maggie's elbow. "You did it," he said quietly. "We did it," she corrected. "You helped make this possible, helped protect the space for it to happen." "Still," Robert said, "this is yours and Daniel's. Be proud of it." She was. Surprised to realize it, but yes, she was proud. Not the loud, triumphant pride of victory, but the quiet, satisfied pride of work completed, of promises kept, of following through when following through had been difficult. Sarah found her later, hugged her. "Mom, that was beautiful. Dad would have been so proud. He would have given you credit," Maggie said. "Would have said this was collaborative, that I couldn't have done it without all the help." "But you did do it," Sarah said. "With help, yes, but you did it. You finished what scared you. You stood up when it was hard. You kept going when you wanted to quit. That's not nothing. That's everything." The event wound down as evening approached. People filtered out, thanking Maggie, thanking each other, taking contact information, already talking about reunions, about staying connected, about the community that had formed around these stories. Helen was one of the last to leave. She hugged Maggie, long and tight. "Thank you," she said, "for finishing this, for giving Frank's story context, for proving that fighting back matters." "Did it matter?" Maggie asked. "Frank is still gone, Richard is still free, the system still let it happen. But it won't happen as easily next time," Helen said, "because you showed people it could be fought, because you proved that documentation and persistence in refusing to quit could win. That matters." Maybe not to Frank, but to the next person. To them, it matters everything. That night, Maggie sat in Daniel's office. The podcast was live, available on all the major platforms. The website was up. The social media accounts were active. The work was done, complete. No more editing, no more deadlines, no more pressure. Just the quiet satisfaction of completion. She looked at the empty chair where Daniel used to sit, at the equipment he had used, at the space that would always be his even though he was gone. Some absences never filled. Some losses never healed completely. You just learn to live around them, to build a life that acknowledged the whole while not falling into it. Her phone buzzed. Email from Jennifer Kim at the Cultural Center. The podcast already had 3,000 downloads. Comments were pouring in. People sharing it, thanking them, saying how much the stories meant, how important it was to preserve these voices, how Daniel's vision had been needed. Another email from Robert, tomorrow night. Dinner, no pressure, just two people who earned a celebration. Are you still willing? She typed back, yes, see you tomorrow. She closed the laptop, turned off the desk lamp, stood in Daniel's office in the darkness, and felt something she had not felt in months. Not quite peace, not quite closure, but something adjacent to both. The recognition that grief and life could coexist, that honoring the past and building a future were not contradictory, that Daniel's death had been a loss, but did not have to be the end of her story. Life insisted. Even when you did not want it to, even when moving forward felt like betrayal, even when the weight of loss made every step difficult, life insisted. And eventually, if you let it, that insistence became invitation. The invitation to keep going, to find new purpose, to discover that survival could transform into something more than just not dying, could become actual living. Not the same living as before, not the life she had planned, but a life nonetheless, real and present and possible. She walked to the window, looked out at the neighborhood, at the house across the street where Richard had lived, where he still lived, diminished and chastened, but still there, at Helen's house 3 doors down, at Emma's house with its toys scattered in the yard, at the community that had been broken and was healing, that had been silent and had found voice. The utility box was visible from this window. Ordinary, unlocked, exactly as it should be. The symbol of where everything had changed, where silence had ended and voice had begun, where accommodation had transformed into resistance, where grief had discovered that fighting back was also a form of survival. Tomorrow she would have dinner with Robert, would explore what friendship might become when given space and time, would take one small step toward a future that included possibility instead of just loss. Next week, she would start volunteering at the Cultural Center, helping other people tell their stories, using what she had learned from Daniel, from the project, from the fight, teaching others that their voices mattered, that documentation and persistence could create change, that standing up was worth it even when standing up was terrifying. Next month, she would consider what came after. Whether to sell the house or stay, whether to maintain Daniel's office's shrine or transform it into something new, whether to keep teaching or find different work, whether to let grief define her or to define herself as someone who had survived grief and built something from the surviving. But tonight, she stood at the window and let herself feel the full weight of the last months, the fear and the fighting, the loss and the finding, the silence and the voice, the ending and the beginning, all of it together, all of it real, all of it part of who she was becoming. She thought about Frank Morrison, about the recording of his last conversation with Richard, about how his story had ended in a way that should never have happened, about how his death had mattered, had been the evidence that changed everything, had been the proof that silence enabled cruelty and voice created accountability. She thought about Daniel, about his belief that stories mattered, about his patience in asking questions, about his gift for making space, about how even in death his work continued, his vision fulfilled, his legacy alive. She thought about herself, about Margaret Chen, who had spent 53 years being quiet, who had made herself small to make others comfortable, who had chosen accommodation over confrontation 1,000 times, who had finally found a line she could not cross, a lock she could not accept, a silence she could not maintain. The woman in the window's reflection was different from the woman who had discovered that lock weeks ago. Not completely transformed, not unrecognizable, but different in the ways that mattered, stronger, more certain, more willing to take up space, more comfortable with her own voice. Outside, the neighborhood settled into evening. Lights came on in windows. People moved through their houses, living their lives, facing their own challenges, fighting their own battles, building their own stories. And in Daniel's office, in the house on Sycamore Drive, Margaret Chen stood at the window and allowed herself to imagine tomorrow, and the tomorrow after that, and all the tomorrows that would come. Not with dread, not with just endurance, but with something that felt almost like hope. The kind of hope that acknowledged pain while not being destroyed by it, that recognized loss while not being defined by it, that understood grief was permanent while also understanding that grief did not have to be everything. The kind of hope that insisted life continued, that insisted meaning could be found, that insisted voice mattered and stories had power, and standing up changed things even when the change was slow and incomplete and required sacrifice. She turned from the window, walked through the house that held so many memories, turned off lights, locked doors, prepared for sleep. Tomorrow would come whether she was ready or not, so she would be ready, or she would not be ready but would show up anyway. Because courage, she had learned, was not the absence of fear. It was showing up despite the fear, speaking up despite the risk, standing up despite the cost, finishing what you started despite wanting to quit. Courage was many small things. Every day you choose to try, choose to speak, choose to not give up. That was courage. That was voice. That was the legacy Daniel had left and she had claimed, and that finally was enough.